What's up guys, hope you're having a good day. In this video we're going to be going into a lot of depth on each of the main card fights taking place this weekend at UFC 304, and we're going to be going through each of these fights, taking a look at them from a betting perspective. All the information that I'm going to be sharing with you in today's video is backed up by many hours of research that I've spent studying the past matchups of all the fighters we're going to be talking about in this video, and also 15 years of experience betting on the sport of mixed martial arts. If you like these breakdown videos, you'd like to watch my breakdowns for all the other fights on this card, don't forget to check out my website, MMABettingTips.com, where you'll find breakdown videos for all the other very interesting matchups on this card, such as Muhammad Mokaev versus Manel Kape. I'll leave a link to that in the description below. And if you watch every UFC event live, you might get a lot of value out of my live betting service. Over the last 8 years, we've made a profit on approximately 70% of UFC events. I think the exact percentage, something like 69.33%. Live betting is my bread and butter. It's what I specialize in, is what I do best at. And if you click the link in the description below to go to the live betting page on my website, you can find a little video here of a fight we live bet in the past, which will basically show you what you can expect if you jump on board and join our live betting group. So it's time we get into breaking down these fights. But before we do, I want to give a general overview of something that is going to impact all the matchups in this weekend's card, so that I don't end up repeating myself in every breakdown video, because of course we need to talk about home advantage and what that means for the British fighters competing at UFC 304 on Saturday night. We also need to talk about how the time zone may potentially impact the athletes on Saturday night, because obviously the event doesn't start until 11 PM local time in the UK, which means, by the time Leon Edwards and Belal Muhammad fight, it's likely to be, 5 AM, which is obviously not ideal for the circadian rhythm, your sleep patterns, all that kind of thing. It's a little bit strange. So we're going to get into that, and it'll save us having to repeat ourselves when we talk about the impact of home advantage on each of these matchups, because there are some general rules and principles that apply to all of these fights. So let's start off by talking about home advantage then. So when we look at this card, we can see that there's a lot of British fighters on this card. In fact, there's a British fighter competing in almost every matchup this weekend, and obviously home advantage in the UK is absolutely huge for many reasons, which we'll go into in a moment. But in terms of the stats, Fightnomics, which is a book written a very long time ago, I think it was written back in like 2014, 2015, around about them. They basically looked at the stats behind home advantage in different countries, and they looked at the percentage of times a British fighter won a fight against a non-British fighter on UFC events in the UK. I believe the British fighter won around 66% of the time. So it's not a huge percentage, but definitely a bit of an edge that can't be ignored. Now, of course, statistics are only useful when they're interpreted correctly, and we can put some of that percentage down to, obviously, favourable matchmaking. For example, there are some fights on this card where British fighters have got favourable matchups, such as Nathaniel Wood versus Daniel Pineda, which is going to influence that statistic somewhat, because obviously whenever the UFC do an event in a home nation, they want to entertain the home fans that have paid a lot of money for tickets. So naturally, the matchmaking a lot of the time is going to favour the home fighters. However, that percentage is 66% when British fighters fight non-British fighters in the UK and win. Can't be ignored, and it does give a definite edge in terms of home advantage this weekend. So we're going to talk about the reasons why that's a thing. But before we do, we also need to talk about the impact that the time, or the start time of this event, could have on the athletes as well. So Saturday night's event starts at 11 PM local time, and that is tricky. So I could be wrong, but from memory, the last time the UFC did this was for the pay-per-view card in Manchester, headlined by Dan Henderson and Michael Bisping. I think it was Bisping's first title defense. Again, I could be wrong. But that was the last time I recall them holding an event in the UK at a time which was for US broadcasting. And that event was obviously a long time ago. We can actually pull it up. Let's pull it up, because there is something interesting on there that I want to show you. So if we just pull up that card. And again, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe other events in the UK have been adjusted for US broadcasting times. But I don't think they have since this one, which was obviously 8 years ago. Very, very long time ago. And I'm probably right, because obviously over 2-3 year period, COVID impacted UFC events, with the majority of events being held in the Apex until very recently. So we can see that the start time of UFC 204 was 10 PM Eastern time, and the start time of UFC 304, a bit of a coincidence, how is 204 and 304, but the start time of this one is going to be 6 PM Eastern. Hang on, that's incorrect. So this start time has got to be incorrect, because if I go to UFC Fight Pass, yeah, I think these start times on Tapology are incorrect. I think they've listed the start time for the main card, not the start time for the overall card, because if I go to the schedule for this week's events, you can see that here we go. There we go. If I scroll up, you can see that the prelims start at 11 PM. So the start time for UFC 204 is incorrect. It would have started about 11 PM as well. I remember, because I watched it. So I tried this week to find some clips of fighters talking about the impact that the late local start time had on them from back in 2016, but it wasn't easy to find any fighters talking about it, probably because it was 8 years ago. But I remember in the aftermath of this event, a lot of the fighters that competed on this card complained that the time zone really threw them off, because the British fighters, obviously, as much as you can try to adjust your sleep cycle and change your time zone to kind of be ready to compete in the middle of the night, your circadian rhythms all going to be off, and it's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to change your body clock, no matter how much hard work you put into it. This isn't a topic I've got a lot of experience in, because obviously I have to adjust my time zone and body clock every week when I switch from European time zone to US time zone to live bet these events and then switch back to European time zone. So I do this myself every week. It's very difficult. So I remember back in 2016, British fighters were talking about how hard it was to kind of get up for the fight and stay full of energy and kind of be ready for the fight in the middle of the night. And what was surprising is that you would think that it would kind of give foreign fighters an advantage, right? So if you're living and training in the United States, and then you come over to the UK and you fight on US time zone, you'd think that would give you an advantage. But actually, I remember fighters even from outside of the UK complaining about the event being in the middle of the night as well. And I know that fans in the arena were kind of sleepy and stuff, and judging and refereeing on the night was really bad because obviously they were tired, they couldn't do their job properly. And when we even look at the main event, I remember, I think it was Dan Hardy that was theorizing that the reason why this fight might have been scored for Bisping was not only home advantage, but because the judges were basically falling asleep, because it was like 5 AM local time when the fight took place, because from memory, it was a very, very bad decision. Dan Henderson should have won the fight. Let's look at how the media scores played out for this matchup. Let's take a look. I know watching the fight live, I had it a draw personally, so it does seem like the majority of people had it for Bisping, but people were pretty split at the time on which way the fight should be scored. So, just something to think about. A couple of weeks ago when we had that event in Denver, at altitude, a lot of the fighters put in strange performances, and I think a big part of that was because of the altitude. We could see a lot of strange performances this weekend as well, if the time zone kind of throws fighters off. So, one other thing that I noticed about this event, which is interesting, it's obviously too small of a sample size for us to kind of make a definitive judgment on, but it's just something for us to bear in mind this weekend, and that's how many finishes they were on this card. So if we look at the card, right, so there's 11 fights on the card, and we can see there's one fight went to a decision here, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 fights ended inside the distance. And even though the Bisping-Henderson fight went to a decision, obviously if you've watched that fight, you'll know that Bisping almost got knocked out about 20 times in that fight. Henderson hurt him real bad, like many times. Of course I'm exaggerating, but Bisping was in a lot of trouble. So that one almost ended inside the distance as well. It was very close to being stopped, but Bisping's a tough fucker who managed to hang in there. So what's interesting about this is that it could indicate that, again, because of the time zone, finishes are more likely because fighters maybe just get tired and can't defend themselves, or they get tired and they lack concentration, so they get caught with something. It's just interesting to me how there's 9 finishes on an 11 fight card broadcast in the middle of the night. Another interesting thing to pay attention to on this card is the number of fights that ended late. So we can see this fight ended in round 3, this fight ended in round 3, and this fight ended in round 3 as well. Now maybe that is just a coincidence. However, what we do know is that only 10% of fights end in round 3. So I'm not going to get my calculator out, but if 3 fights out of 11 end in round 3, don't know the exact percentage, but I'd guess that is about 26 to 27% of fights on this card ended in round 3, which is higher than the average number of fights that end in round 3, which is, as we know, as we've just said, 10%. So could it also be that we're getting more late finishes on this card because, again, fighters are extra tired or not concentrating, which leads to more late finishes than usual? So this, at the end of the day, is too small of a sample size to make a judgment on. But what we do have is the majority of fights ending inside the distance. What we also have is a higher percentage of fights ending in round 3 than you would expect. And again, it's a very small sample size, so that's maybe just the way the cards fell on the night. But obviously, these fighters, some of them are not going to be competing until 3 a.m., 4 a.m., 5 a.m. in the morning local time, which is going to do strange things to the body no matter how well you prepare for it. So for me, it's just something you might want to think about if you're betting the fights this weekend. And the way that I would perhaps use this information to bet this card is maybe just thinking twice if you're considering betting the over on any fights, because judging by UFC 204, because of the time zone, fighters complain about being tired, perhaps finishes inside the distance are more likely, or is certainly an additional risk factor that may put your overs in trouble. And maybe if you're considering, betting some unders or fight does not go to a decision props, you haven't got over the line on it yet, you haven't pulled the trigger yet, maybe this data will make you get over the line on that bet. I don't know. You've got to do your own research, make your own mind up on it. I just think there's a lot of correlations between UFC 204, UFC 304 because of the time zone. And so it is something you might want to think about this weekend. So now we want to talk about the reasons why home advantage is a big deal going into the fights this weekend. We've already said there's a British fighter competing in almost every fight on Saturday night. So let's start off with the easiest thing to explain, which is, in fact, no, let's leave that till last, because we can tie it all up better if we leave it till last. Okay, so the first reason why home advantage is absolutely massive in the UK is because sports is very tribal in the UK. If you guys watch football, for example, you know, home advantage is a big thing in football in the UK because the fans really get behind the home fighters. It's very tribal, and fans do their best to create an intimidating atmosphere for the opposition, which enables the home fighter to feed off that energy and perform better, and it can rock the confidence and throw, you know, the away team, or in this case the visiting fighter, off their game. So the British fans on Saturday night will be doing their best to create an incredible atmosphere in the arena to try and give their support to the home fighter and basically get inside the head of the opposition. And this is something that is very difficult to deal with, especially in the UFC, where fighters don't compete under these circumstances very often. Atmospheres in UFC events in most countries around the world, specifically the United States, where the majority of UFC events take place, is very poor. Aside from the odd Ric Flair woo, the odd cheer, you know, or the odd USA, USA chant, there really isn't much crowd support for any fighters in the United States. Occasionally you do get it when Conor McGregor fights and the Irish turn out in America for him, but outside of that, you don't really get support for fighters in the same way you do in Europe. And even when you look at events in Brazil and Mexico, it's not the same either. I've noticed on Brazilian cards, Mexican cards, those fans still get frustrated with their fighters, whereas on UK cards, and cards in the rest of Europe as well, to be fair, mainland Europe, it was the same in Sweden, same in Germany, same in Poland, the home fans really get behind their guys. And guys like Belal Muhammad, Bobby Green, you know, Gregory Rodrigues, Giga Chikadze, for example, they won't be prepared for that. They will not be prepared for it. It's very tribal. It's very passionate. It's very explosive and fiery. And the reason why this gives, and there are multiple reasons why this impact of the crowd gives home fighters an advantage and contributes towards that statistic that British fighters win around 66% of the time when they face foreign fighters in the UK. So let's talk about the reasons why that is a big thing. So the first reason why it's a big thing is motivation, right? If you are fighting in a cage fight to the death and you've got 20,000 people supporting you, sending positive vibes your way, when you get tired, when you get hurt, when you get put in a bad position, it's going to be way easier for you to dig deep, turn the fight around, and continue to perform and continue to fight when you're in a tough spot. And the example I always give is that of a personal trainer, right? If you're just running on a treadmill in your house and you've been running and running and running, you start to get tired and your feet start to hurt and your lungs start to ache, it's very easy when you're just running on a treadmill in your house by yourself to just stop running, right? Just hit the stop button on the treadmill, just stop. You don't need to keep going. Who cares? It's very easy for us to stop and take a break. But why do people hire personal trainers, right? You don't really need a personal trainer. All the information that you can get from a personal trainer can be found online. But the reason why personal training is a great profession, a great job, a great industry is because we all need motivation. We all need to be held accountable by someone. We all need to be given that extra drive. And when you've got a personal trainer and you're in the gym running on a treadmill and you get tired and you want to quit and they're encouraging you to keep going, it's much easier to dig deep and keep running on that treadmill rather than hitting the stop button because you don't want to let that personal trainer down. They give you that energy to keep going. They keep you accountable. And in the case of home advantage on UFC fights, it's very much the same thing. You're much less likely to quit. You're much less likely to underperform. You're much less likely to give in when you get tired if you've got the crowd behind you. And we've all been in situations where, you know, we've been playing sports or we've been doing a workout, we've been running with friends, and we want to give up and we're not feeling it and we're not feeling good, and then someone will shout some encouragement towards you. It might be a coach, it might be a friend, it might be a family member, and it just gives you the lift to keep going. That's why home advantage is a big deal. It also has the opposite effect for visiting fighters, where if you're, you know, I'm trying to give a realistic example. I can't find one. Okay, this is not how I see this fight going at all. This is not how I see this fight going at all. We'll get into breaking down this fight shortly. But say, for example, Bobby Green is on the bottom and Paddy Pimblett is on top of him, smashing him with ground and pound, or, you know, Bobby Green, you know, he's on Bobby Green's back hunting for the rear naked choke. And, you know, Bobby's bust up and he's tired and he's hurt and he's in a bad position on the ground, and he's got Paddy on top of him, smashing him. And you got the crowd chanting, "Oh, Paddy the baddie." You know, psychologically, you know, it's going to be very difficult for Green to dig deep and keep going, right? Because if you're already feeling down, if you're already, you know, in a bad spot, if you already want to quit, it's much easier to do that when you've got like 20,000 people wishing bad things upon you and sending negative vibes your way. So, psychologically, that is why home advantage is a big deal. Now, the other two reasons why home advantage is a pretty big deal. First of all, it can influence referees. So, for example, if and again, this is not how I see these fights going. I'm just trying to give you the best examples I can, just to kind of keep this moving, right? And we'll get into the breakdown shortly. But say, for example, Leon Edwards is on, you know, has been taken down and he's on the bottom against Belal Muhammad, and Belal Muhammad is on top of him, and Leon Edwards can't work his way back up to his feet. So Belal's winning the round, he's winning the position from top position, and Edwards is really struggling to get back up. The crowd start booing, you know, for a stand-up. They start putting pressure on the referee. It is far more likely that the referee will stand up a fight between Leon Edwards and Belal Muhammad when the crowd is putting pressure on the referee to do it, than if Edwards and Muhammad were fighting in the apex with no crowd and the ref would just let the position go, see how it plays out. So in little ways like that, the referee can be influenced by the crowd to benefit the home fighter. Whereas if Edwards gets on top of Muhammad and is beating Muhammad up from top position, then much less likely Muhammad will get stood up, because the ref won't want to piss the crowd off. He's far more likely to let the position go, and that's just the reality of it. The third way in which, obviously, home advantage is a big deal on UK cards in particular, and you all know what I'm going to say, we've all been on the receiving end of this over the years. The third way in which home advantage is a big thing is obviously the judging. Right, we all know about hometown judging, and we know that if rounds are relatively close, or these days with how bad MMA judging is, rounds don't even need to be relatively close. We know if they are relatively close and a fight goes to the judges' scorecards, the judges are far more likely to score that round in favour of the hometown guys. So those are some of the reasons why hometown advantage is a big deal, and just by kind of going over it like that, we won't need to go into a lot of depth on it. In each individual fight, we can just reference hometown advantage, and you guys will know exactly the reasons why it is such a big deal. So let's now break down the main event at this weekend's card, which is such an interesting fight between Leon Edwards and Belal Muhammad. We're going to go into a lot of depth on this one because it's a very, very complicated fight, and I'm very much looking forward to sharing with you exactly why it is a very interesting fight, and we'll pop some video clips in so you can see just how competitive this one could be. So we will start off by taking a look at the odds. We just refresh to get the latest odds, and we can see that, where are we? Okay, so Leon Edwards is the favourite at average odds of about 1.38, which is going to be minus 263 for an implied probability of 72%. And if we take a look at the odds on Muhammad, he's around an average of 3.05, which is going to be plus 205 for an implied probability of 33%. So Edwards is 32 years old, 6'2", with a 74-inch reach, and Muhammad is 36 years old, 5'11", with a 72-inch reach. So a couple of X factors here. First being the age. At 36 years old, Muhammad is at the stage in his career where you would expect him to start declining from fight to fight. At 36 years old, he's pretty old for a welterweight, whereas Leon Edwards, 32 years old, in his prime. Not necessarily say, at this stage in his career he's going to be getting better, but he's certainly in his athletic prime right now. So if we look at the tail of the tape, it doesn't look like there is a massive difference in size between these two. So Edwards is obviously a little bit taller, has a slightly longer reach, but nothing major. But what I am going to say is, when you look at footage of these two, it is quite clear to me that Edwards is by far the stronger, more athletic, more physically imposing fighter. And it's something that I'm going to be referencing a lot throughout this video. It's not something that is easy for me to show you with footage. It's just something that I've learned to get a read on over 15 years of watching the sport and being profitable pretty much every single year of those 15 years betting on UFC. And if you're in my live betting group, this is the kind of thing we talk about a lot. And obviously when fights are taking place, when we sit there together every weekend for 7 hours watching UFC fights, we could talk about this stuff in a lot of depth so you can learn to see it for yourselves. But it isn't going to be easy to show someone being much more physically imposing than their opponent in just a few video clips. It's just something you get a sense for after watching many hours of two fighters compete, which we can't do, or I can't show you in this breakdown, because obviously we don't want this breakdown video to be hours long. So you either need to take my word for it or go do your own research, see for yourself. So Edwards, in my opinion, is by far the bigger, stronger, more physically imposing fighter, even if the tail of the tape doesn't necessarily show it. But it is a big deal in the context of this matchup. So, in terms of how these two match up stylistically, this is one of those fights where there is no doubt in my mind that if it stays standing, Muhammad is very screwed. There's nothing he has for Edwards on the feet. So that's not going to be a massive surprise to anyone. We know Edwards is a very high-level striker, but when you really watch the footage of both guys, it becomes painfully obvious that Edwards is in a completely different level to Muhammad on the feet. The big problem with Muhammad is that he just doesn't have any power in his hands. And this is something that, again, we're going to refer to throughout this video, because Muhammad's lack of physicality does make this a difficult fight for him. But it's especially present on the feet, because aside from having decent leg kicks, he's not really going to be able to trouble Edwards on the feet, in my opinion. Edwards is fast, he's great defensively, he's got good movement, very athletic, hits very hard. And Edwards has also got great cardio, so the version of Edwards you get in round 5 is not all that different from the version of Edwards you get in round 1. He's a cardio machine. So whereas at times there are certain fights where Belal Muhammad can grow into the fight and start to cause his opponents a lot of trouble on the feet when he wears them out with his high output, I don't think that's going to be the case with Edwards, because Edwards doesn't slow, and we've seen Edwards forced to work really, really hard in fights. So on the feet should be all Leon Edwards. And Muhammad's lack of physicality on the feet do create two pretty big issues for him in this matchup. The first issue it creates for him is that Muhammad is at his best when he's on the front foot and he's leading the dance and he's the aggressor. So whenever Muhammad has looked the best in fights, he has been able to take control of the centre of the octagon, pepper his opponents with his boxing and leg kicks, and keep them on the back foot, fighting in a very reactive state, which means they don't really have the time and space to get their own strikes off. And with him leading the dance and mixing things up very nicely, it also makes it very difficult to stop his takedowns, because when he's dictating the pace, when he's in control, when he's leading the dance, when he's on the front foot and he's mixing things up, he's a lot harder to predict what he's going to do. Is a leg kick coming? Is a jab coming? Is a takedown attempt coming? When Muhammad is on the front foot, he's at his best. But the problem with Muhammad is, obviously, in order to be on the front foot and be the aggressor, you have to be able to impose yourself on your opponent. And one of the ways you can do that is with the threat of your grappling, where your opponent, is finding it difficult to open up because they're worried about being taken down, which can enable you to be the aggressor. Or if you have just that power in your hands to push people back to the point where they can't come forward, because every time you land, your shots are way harder, way more impactful than theirs, so you kind of push them back and take control that way. Muhammad's lack of physicality will make it very difficult for him to do that against Edwards. And the first fight between these two is clear evidence of that. We'll show some clips of it in just a little while. The other issue Belal Muhammad has got coming into this fight, from a striking point of view, and we're going to talk about grappling in a moment, but the other issue that Belal Muhammad's lack of physicality costs him with a striking point of view is that he's very predictable. His strategy is very, very predictable. And if you do your homework on this guy, you know exactly what to expect. Because Belal Muhammad fights with this strategy of chipping away at you on the feet and trying to avoid engaging. And then he uses the George St. Pierre strategy of trying to steal rounds with takedowns. The problem with that is you know exactly what he's going to do. So in the second half of every round, Muhammad is going to be looking for a takedown. So you can start to get prepared for it. You can start to see that takedown entry coming. You can start to deal with that style before, or that strategy before Muhammad even shoots the takedown. But another aspect of why Belal Muhammad's lack of physicality will cause him problems when it comes to striking is he doesn't really have the power to hurt you. So when you get guys like Belal Muhammad, they can be very easy to game plan for, because when they come forward, you don't need to really worry a whole lot about their strikes. Because even if they land, they can't really hurt you. They don't have the power. So if you've got a very strong grappler with power in their hands, you're in a very difficult position, because when they come forward, you've got to be very worried about the takedown, but you've also got to be very worried about head strikes if they can hurt you with punches. So you're in this kind of strange middle ground where you can't fully commit to your boxing defense, because then that opens up your lower body for the takedown. And you can't keep your hands down low in anticipation of a takedown attempt to get underhooks in play, because that leaves, obviously, your head open for head strikes, which could be very damaging to you. Now, nobody's going to want to get punched in the face by Belal Muhammad, but when he does come forward looking for his takedowns, which he's obviously going to need to win this fight, because he needs to get this fight to the ground in order to win, it's very difficult for Muhammad, because when he comes forward, Leon's not really going to be worried about his hands all that much. He's going to be worried about the takedown, which makes it very difficult for Muhammad to get the takedown, because he can't get respect in there to set his takedowns up from his boxing. And one of the best examples of fights I've got to show you this would probably be, there's a lot of examples. A good one is going to be J.J. Aldrich against Ariane Lipski, where all Aldrich wanted to do was try and take Lipski down. She didn't throw any punches at all, barely. This just made it very predictable. So Lipski was able to easily deal with the takedowns before Aldrich got anywhere near them. And so Muhammad's going to have a difficult time setting up his takedowns in this fight, because Edwards is going to know exactly what he's going to try and do to him. He knows exactly what Muhammad wants. His strategy, his game plan with stealing rounds, is a tough one. So, in fact, before we go any further, let's show a little bit of footage of the Edwards versus Belal Muhammad fight so that you can see the lack of physicality on the feet that I was talking about. So remember what I said about Belal Muhammad being at his best when he's on the front foot, he's the aggressor, he's taking the fight to his opponent. And that's where he wants to be. He doesn't want to be in a situation where he's on the back foot, on the outside, reacting to what Edwards is doing, because from there, it's harder for him to set up his takedowns, and he's exerting a lot of energy trying to circle away from Edwards, create space and time for himself. It's much harder for him to get his strikes off as well. So what you'll notice about this clip, and again, I'm not going to show the whole thing, so I don't want to make this breakdown super long, but what you're going to see about this section of fight here is Muhammad struggling to get respect in there and being trapped on the outside, and Edwards basically totally in control, dictating the pace of the fight. So this is literally the start of the fight, first 20 seconds. And you can see Edwards has established dominance, taking control of the centre of the octagon. And there's this little sequence here after the foul where Belal comes back into the centre of the octagon and tries to take control away from Edwards. But it doesn't last very long, because as soon as Belal starts to feel Edwards' power, Belal respects Edwards, and he's the one that goes more into a defensive state in the fight. So you can kind of see it there, right? The fight starts with Edwards as the aggressor. There's a foul which breaks up the action. Belal uses that as an opportunity to try and be the aggressor, be on the front foot, which is where he wants to be, because that's where he's at his best when he's a pressure fighter. But then we've just seen Edwards land two nice left hands. Muhammad is starting to feel Edwards' power, and that is swinging control back in Edwards' favour. So then you get a little bit of clinch work here. And what you'll see as the fight wears on, as we approach the halfway point in the round, the more Belal Muhammad feels Edwards' power in his athleticism and his physicality, the more into a defensive shall we see Belal Muhammad go, until the fight eventually settles in this range where Belal Muhammad is on the back foot and Edwards is in total control on the front foot as the aggressor, dictating the pace of the fight, dictating where the fight takes place, where he can just basically snipe Belal, chip away at him, use his superior striking to just outstrike him by a wide margin. And you can just see here now that Belal has felt Edwards' power. He can't push Edwards back anymore because he doesn't have the boxing, he doesn't have the power in his hands, and it's difficult for him to get his takedowns off and set up his takedowns because he doesn't have the time or space in this uncomfortable range on the outside to shoot them. So I think I'll make my point with this. You can see, you know, every once in a while Belal comes forward to try and re-establish control, but then Edwards, you know, will land a shot or two and quickly put Belal onto the back foot, which we see here shortly. Body kick, Belal feels that power, and then he doesn't want more of it and he just backs off. So you can see Edwards is clearly the more physically imposing fighter here, clearly on the front foot. And it is so much more difficult to set takedowns up from the range in which we're seeing Belal fight here on the back foot on the outside than it is when you're the aggressor coming forward. He doesn't have the time and space to get his takedowns off from this range. And he can't get respect in there. He just can't. You know, Edwards has got too much for him. So I think that's a pretty good description of the reasons why this is a very difficult fight for Belal Muhammad if it stays standing and he can't get the fight to the ground. But the good news for Belal Muhammad is that Leon Edwards' takedown defense is very, 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 very bad. I said it 5 times. Leon Edwards' takedown defense is so bad, I had to say it 5 times. Leon Edwards has very bad takedown defense and a very low level ground game. And you guys know me. All I do in these breakdown videos is summarize things I've already seen in the fight footage. We only deal in facts here because the only place you find truth and honesty in this game is in the fight footage. So we always come with receipts. We always show fight footage to back up what we're saying. And we'll show some evidence of Leon Edwards' poor takedown defense, very low level ground game as ever in this breakdown video. And if you appreciate that and you're watching this on YouTube, please hit the like button. It would really help the channel grow. It would mean a lot. Growth is very slow. How many people make breakdown videos, so it would help give my channel a bit of a boost. I would really appreciate it. It would motivate me to keep putting stuff out on YouTube. So, obviously Belal Muhammad is in a lot of trouble if the fight stays standing. He needs to get this fight to the ground. So now we need to talk about the probability that Belal Muhammad has of using a grappling heavy game plan to get this fight to the ground. Now we've already talked in a little bit of detail about why the range in which this fight is likely to take place will make it difficult for Muhammad to get this fight to the ground because of how predictable he is and the range that he is going to be forced to fight in on the back foot. But at the end of the day, Belal Muhammad has some of the best takedown entries in the division. His single leg, his double leg takedown entries are absolutely brilliant. Very well timed. And since he fought Edwards the last time, he's obviously been training with Makhachev and Khabib, which can only mean good things for Belal Muhammad's MMA grappling. So I would expect Belal Muhammad's MMA grappling to be improving at a decent rate, training with Makhachev and Khabib, which could make this a much more difficult fight for Edwards. But again, I'll show you some video footage that suggests even dramatically improved MMA grappling from Belal Muhammad might not be enough this weekend to be able to have success with his grappling. So what we first need to do is show you the issues with Leon Edwards' takedown offense and ground game. And then we need to show you some reasons why it might not matter. So what we're going to do is use the Kamaru Usman fights to show you guys how bad Edwards is on the ground. And of course, if you look at his fights against Rafael dos Anjos, it was what he got taken down once against Colby. Colby didn't really try to grapple in that fight. It was a strange performance. You know, there's evidence in other fights of Edwards is very bad takedown offense and ground game, but the Usman fight does the best job of showing it. What I will say is, Usman didn't grapple anywhere near as much as he should have in these two fights. So what we're going to do, again, we don't want to make this breakdown super long, and we don't need to focus on the strikings. I think we can all agree Muhammad is in a lot of trouble when it comes to striking in this fight. So this is the first fight. So in order to understand, so this is where it gets really complicated. So obviously not all MMA grapplers are created equal. Not all MMA grapplers are fighting with the same style of grappling, right? This is not a linear black and white conversation. This is a very complex topic. And understanding the nuances of MMA grappling and how MMA grappling applies to each stylistic matchup is one of the key reasons why we're able to make a profit on approximately 70% of UFC events in live betting. We really understand this shit. So I'm going to go into a lot of depth on this topic now, and just know this is coming from many, many years of experience and a lot of profit. Many, many Saturday nights sat in front of the TV, live betting my balls off. So no one is going to go out and say that Belal Muhammad is a better MMA grappler than Kamaru Usman. No one's going to do that because it's not true, right? Kamaru Usman's one of the best MMA grapplers of all time. However, Belal Muhammad's style of MMA grappling does pose challenges to Leon Edwards that Kamaru Usman's style of MMA grappling did not pose him. So what does that mean? What it basically means is there will be people out there with a very linear view of the sport that will look through the sport or look through the lens of MMA with a very simplified view. And they will think that because Kamaru Usman wasn't able to cause Leon Edwards problems with his MMA grappling, Belal Muhammad won't be able to either, without realizing that the style of Kamaru Usman's MMA grappling is easier for Leon Edwards to deal with than Belal Muhammad's style of MMA grappling, even though Kamaru Usman is a better MMA grappler than Belal Muhammad, which I know is a bit of a paradox. But the reason why Belal Muhammad's style of MMA grappling is potentially much more difficult for Leon Edwards to deal with is because the style of takedown entry that both guys shoot with. So, generally speaking, more than likely because Kamaru Usman has two badly injured knees, it is very, very rare that you'll see Kamaru Usman shoot deep in on his opponent's legs and hips, right? Most of the time when you see Kamaru Usman shoot a takedown, it'll be like this one, where he is shooting very, very high up above his opponent's hips. Watch this. As he comes forward and he goes for the takedown, you can see he's quite high up, right? Quite high up above Edwards' hips. Now, obviously Kamaru Usman is very good at working the takedowns from this position, but the vast majority of Usman's takedowns in his career have come where he's driven his opponent into the cage with a takedown above hip height, and he starts working for a takedown from there with persistent chain wrestling. Belal Muhammad's style of takedown entry is way more dangerous for someone like Leon Edwards because Belal Muhammad shoots much deeper in on the legs and hips of his opponents than Usman does. And if we think about the body type of Belal Muhammad as well, this is where he does, again, pose some problems to Edwards because at 5'11", Belal Muhammad is quite short for a welterweight. He's small, he's compact. So when he shoots his single and double leg takedown entries, naturally he's getting very deep in on the legs and hips of his opponent. And if we think about a Jenga tower, right? If you're playing Jenga, what's the fastest way to topple over a Jenga tower? It's taking out the pieces at the bottom, right? It's exactly the same with MMA grappling. If you want a high probability or a good chance of taking your opponent down, the deeper you get in on the legs and hips of your opponent, the better chance you've got of getting the takedown, because that's how you can upset their balance. So what I'm going to do very quickly is show you the difference between a takedown entry from Kamaru Usman and a takedown entry from Belal Muhammad. So we'll go to the Luque fight to show this. So you've just seen there the takedown entry here from Usman comes above hip height. And if we look at a Belal Muhammad takedown, like here, maybe we can slow it down. And bear in mind, Luque is quite short for a welterweight as well. I think Vicente Luque is like about 5'11" as well. So with Edwards being 6'2", yeah, he's 5'11" as well. So bear in mind, with Edwards being 6'2", naturally, when Belal Muhammad shoots in, he's going to be even deeper on the legs and hips of someone like Edwards than he would be on Luque here. And Luque's in quite a low stance as well with his knees bent, whereas Edwards doesn't fight so much in that stance. So here we can see, look how deep in on the legs and hips he is. So if we compare, if we go back here, so this is generally the majority of Usman's takedown entries come at this height. And they're quite stiff and laboured as well. There we go. So look at the height that he comes in there. Whereas look at the height that Belal's in here. Look how low down he is. And he really drives through and gets it. Belal Muhammad does a really good job of always getting in on the legs. And we can show another example here. Just pay attention to how deep he gets in on the legs. Any second now, please. It's coming any second. Sorry, guys. Here we go. Again, look at how deep he is on the legs here. Right in on the legs. So fast, the cameraman doesn't even have time to adjust. Look how he's going for that outside trip as he shoots in. Look at the difference. Trying to get the exact frame I want. Look how deep in on the legs he is. Not only has he got the outside trip off Luque's left leg, but both arms are damn near wrapped around the back of Luque's knees, compared to the typical sort of takedown entry you see from Usman, which is slow, laboured and above hip height. So it is far more difficult for Edwards to stop the kind of takedown entry that Belal is shooting compared to the type of takedown that Usman is shooting. Now, it won't be easy for Belal Muhammad to get his takedowns off. We've already explained the reasons why. But when he does shoot, I think the probability of him taking Edwards down is quite high. And we know that Belal Muhammad has got amazing cardio to keep shooting those types of takedowns. So we just skip through. I only want to show you Edwards' lack of takedown defense. That takedown was very high up above his hips, so he did a good job of stuffing it. We go into round two. There's not as much grappling in the second fight as there was the first. This is obviously the second fight. Here we can see this time Usman shoots in quite high up above the hips of Edwards, but he very, very quickly reaps the legs out from underneath Edwards. And this is a really good example of why it's important to get in deep on the legs and hips of your opponent. When Usman shot those takedowns above hip height, didn't get anywhere near them. As soon as he went to the lower legs, just like a Jenga tower, slipped that piece out at the bottom, the tower topples over. We see that with Edwards here. And what you really notice about Edwards when you watch his fights is, if you do get in deep on the legs of Edwards, he goes down very, very easily. And we see that here, and we'll obviously show you more clips of it happening. So this is where we need to start to talk about physicality. So Edwards' takedown defense is very, 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 very bad. I'll say it 5 times again. Very bad. I've no doubt in my mind that Belal Muhammad can get Edwards down, because Belal Muhammad is a very good offensive wrestler and Leon Edwards has very bad takedown defense. So Belal will get this fight to the ground. I've got no doubt about that. But when you look at MMA grapplers, there's almost always a trade-off that like mortal men have to make. And the vast majority of MMA grapplers will either have crushing physicality to their grappling or never-ending cardio for days. It's very rare you'll get MMA grapplers that are both physically imposing and have cardio for days. And when you get an MMA grappler that does have amazing cardio and great grappling control and abundance of physicality, they tend to be some of the best fighters in the world, like Kamaru Usman or a Khabib Nurmagomedov or an Islam Makhachev. It's very rare that you get an MMA grappler with amazing cardio and crushing physicality. Even with some of the best MMA grapplers in the world right now, like Merab Dvalishvili, his grappling control and physicality is not great. If you look at Merab Dvalishvili's fights, he often struggles to establish grappling control early in a matchup. If you think about one of his recent fights against Henry Cejudo, didn't have any success with his MMA grappling in the first half of that fight. He had to wear Cejudo down with his work rate and relentlessness, his persistent grappling, before he could then kind of get Cejudo down and kind of hold him down and control him. But then what's Merab Dvalishvili's biggest strength? Never-ending cardio, right? The guy never gets tired. So that's the trade-off you always have to make. It's very rare you'll get an MMA grappler with amazing physically imposing grappling control and amazing cardio. So the issue that Belal Muhammad has is he's got amazing cardio. He never gets tired. Never even see this guy breathing heavy, right? This guy can go hard for 3 rounds, no problem. 5 rounds, I mean, we've only seen him go 5 rounds once, but 5 rounds twice, actually, sorry. But this guy, amazing cardio. But the trade-off of having that amazing cardio is that he lacks physicality. His grappling control isn't very good. And to highlight this point, we're going to go back to the Luque fight, just so that you can kind of see this for yourself. And then when we go through the rest of the footage on Edwards and Usman, you'll understand what I'm talking about. So when we think about guys with crushing grappling control and an abundance of physicality to their ground game, we think about someone like Khabib as the best example. When Khabib would take someone down and grab a hold of them, it didn't matter who they were. Edson Barboza, Dustin Poirier, Conor McGregor, Justin Gaethje. Didn't matter who they were. If Khabib got you down and grabbed a hold of you and would get on top of you, you couldn't move on the bottom. He just had this crushing physicality, this crushing grappling control where you couldn't get any space to move or breathe. And when you see guys have that, they're a nightmare, right? Because unless they get tired, they stick to you like glue. It's very difficult to shake them off. Belal Muhammad doesn't have that. He's got great MMA grappling, but doesn't have crushing physicality to his grappling control. And I can show you why. So if we go to the takedown in round 1. Now, bearing in mind, Luque's takedown offense is pretty bad, and he's pretty weak off his back as well. But Belal's hit this takedown here, right? So Belal Muhammad's in a great position. Vicente Luque's in a very bad position. He's out in the middle of the octagon. He's nowhere near the cage, so from here he doesn't have the cage that he can use to wall walk back up to his feet without moving over to it. And with Belal Muhammad on top of you, it's a bad place to be, with time running out in the round as well. So if we hit play, you can see Luque's gone to the closed guard, and with only 2 minutes left in the round, Muhammad's in a great position here to see the round out from top position, put this round in the bank. Now, if Khabib was on top of you from this position, or someone else with a very, very heavy top game, Luque would be screwed because he's weak off his back, he's nowhere near the cage, he can't wall walk. And a really strong MMA grappler with a heavy top game would just be able to stay heavy and tight to Luque, see this round out from top position. So he's taken down about 2 minutes and 10 seconds left to go in the round. If we just skip through, we can see that 30 seconds in, Belal advances to half guard, and then Luque immediately recovers the full guard, and then manages to go knee on belly and start to create space for himself off his back. In the process, he's scrambling closer and closer over to the cage where he can wall walk. So he's now been on the ground about a minute, and we can see he is getting space off the bottom to move. Gets more space off the bottom to move here as Belal tries to pass his guard. And again, Luque does the same thing he did a few moments ago. He goes knee on belly and uses this as an opportunity to get closer to the cage to put himself in a position to wall walk. He then gets to his knees and stands back up. So he was on the ground for about a minute and a half. But when Luque actually made an attempt to get back up to his feet, he got up pretty easily. The 2 times that he tried to create space for himself off his back and go knee on belly, Not only was he able to create quite a lot of space for himself off his back both times to get to his knees, but he was also able to move around a lot on the ground to position himself closer to the cage to wall walk. When you get guys with a heavy top game, great grappling control, you just don't get the opportunity to move around on the bottom like that. But that's just one example. Let's go into round 2. And again, you see a similar pattern to Belal Muhammad, where in every round he tries to stand and strike in the first half of the round, and then he just tries to steal rounds with takedowns. Here's another takedown here. There we go. So taken down with 1 minute and 40 seconds left to go in the round. We just skip through. And again, about 35 seconds in, you can start to see Luque trying to create space for himself off his back. Gets to his knees. Scoots over to the cage. Hesitates for a moment. And about a minute after being taken down, any second now, turns into Belal and stands back up. Just over a minute after being taken down. So again, Belal Muhammad has hit a really nice takedown, but he doesn't have the grappling control or physicality to hold Luque down. And just like Leon Edwards, Luque is very weak off his back. And even though he's a high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, he's one of these BJJ guys that just spends way too long on his back hunting for long shot takedowns. So here's another example. Nice takedown entry again from Belal. Again, Luque in a terrible position out in the middle of the octagon. Nowhere near the cage to be able to wall walk. He's taken down about, 2 minutes 15 left to go in the round. Same thing. Knee on belly. 45 seconds after being taken down, gets to his knees, stands back up. So you can see Belal is great at getting these takedowns, but doesn't have the grappling control to hold Luque down. I think I make my point on this. Taken down. About 3 minutes 30 in the round to go. Minute and a half later, Belal in side control. Luque easily gets to his knees, gives up his back, and as Belal goes to the back take, scrambles back up to his feet. Very nice. So, again, I've been betting on the UFC for 15 years. I've made a profit every year in the last 15 years. Live betting is my speciality. Understanding these little nuances to MMA grappling is what I built a career off, what I've made a lot of money off. And I can tell you, after watching footage of Belal Muhammad, he really lacks physicality to his ground game. And this is something that you can't really train for or develop, in my experience. You either have it or you don't. You're either an Andre Petroski or you're not. You're either a Khabib or you're not. You're either a Dvalishvili or you're not. It's your body type, it's your genetics, it's your DNA. You're either a Hector Lombard, a Yoel Romero, or you're not. And so even though I would expect Belal Muhammad to have improved his MMA grappling, training with the likes of Khabib and Makhachev, at 36 years old, I don't think it's going to be that likely he suddenly develops an abundance of physicality to his ground game and grappling, which means he's probably going to struggle to hold Edwards down, for footage I'll show you in a moment. Now, obviously, there's very little performance-enhancing drug testing in the UFC anymore, since the UFC told USADA to kick rocks at the beginning of this year. So it's possible that Belal Muhammad could be on the secret juice now, and that could make him a lot more physically imposing this weekend. But for me, it's unlikely that a 36-year-old fighter who is at that stage in his career where he's going to be declining would show up with like a significantly difficult athletic build than he has, in his career. So there you can kind of see evidence that Belal Muhammad lacks physicality and grappling control. But that doesn't excuse the fact that Edwards' takedown offense is extremely bad. And Belal Muhammad will be able to get this fight to the ground. So, if we just now look at Edwards' takedown offense, right, it's dreadful. There's no way to sugarcoat it. Edwards' takedown offense is very bad. His ground game is so bad. Edwards is so bad on the ground. But, remember what we said about Edwards when it comes to striking, where he's got that raw physicality, that raw power, that athleticism to his striking. It's the reason why he can pull off a head kick knockout in the final seconds of a title fight against one of the greatest welterweights of all time, right? Edwards is built different. And that physicality, that power, that athleticism that he's got on the feet to be a very dynamic striker, a very explosive striker, also translates to his MMA grappling, because even though from a technical point of view Edwards is a terrible MMA grappler, because he's so strong and athletic, to some extent he can get away with it, particularly when he faces significantly weaker opponents, which I wouldn't say Kamaru Usman is, because Usman's a very strong, physically imposing guy, far stronger and far more physically imposing than Belal Muhammad. So if I can see Edwards demonstrate terrible technique on the ground against someone like Kamaru Usman and get away with it, very, very likely he can also get away with it against Belal Muhammad too, which potentially makes this a very difficult fight for Muhammad. My one issue that I have with Edwards is at times he takes too long to work through bad positions on the ground, but he does work through them and he's difficult to hold down for any length of time. So here we can see Usman's got the takedown, he's moved to the back, and Usman's a big strong guy on his back. But you can see Edwards just stands back up. Just stands back up. And again, Usman in on a takedown. And Edwards just stands back up. Now, granted, Usman didn't have, wasn't really tight to Edwards, didn't have control of his body, didn't tie the legs up or anything like that. But what you notice about Leon Edwards is, even though his takedown offense and ground game's a fucking joke, awful, he's difficult to hold down. And you see it here. Usman gets a takedown, single leg. Edwards goes down easily, and in these kind of clips you can see that Belal Muhammad's takedown entries are so clean, there's so much drive on them compared to Usman's, that if Usman's hitting very weak ass techniques to get Edwards down here, Belal Muhammad should be able to get Edwards down, I would imagine, relatively comfortably. So then Usman's in top position, 4 minutes 15 left to go in the round, and Edwards, in a similar way to what Luque did against Belal Muhammad, starts to go knee on belly to create space for himself off his back, elevates Usman, just stands back up about a minute after being taken down. And then we do get some pretty savage cage grabs here from Leon. So if we skip through then, that's just an example of how, again, Edwards' takedown offense is so bad, but he's able to get away with it because he's a big, strong dude that's difficult to hold down. We skip through. We're only focusing on grappling. We know Edwards has got the advantage on the feet. We don't need to spend tons of time on that. And we're really only focusing on how Mr. Edwards reacts to working his way back up his feet. And again, I don't want to make this breakdown super long, so of course you're seeing Usman shoot loads of takedowns, which Edwards is defending. But again, Usman's takedown entries are slow, stiff, above hip height. Very, very telegraphed. It is deep on the leg, but it's so fucking telegraphed. Like, you can see Edwards is ready for it here, carrying his hands down low in anticipation of the shot before Usman even gets near him. Look, he's ready for it. He's ready for it. So it's not the same as a Belal Muhammad takedown entry, which is much better timed and much deeper in on the legs and hips. And again, look, I know people watching this on YouTube, you know, guys in my community get it, but people watching this on YouTube will be mind blown. They'll be like, oh my god, how is this guy saying that Belal Muhammad's takedowns are better than Usman's? This guy's fucking clueless. It's a complex sport, motherfuckers. It's a complex sport. And, you know, you can't look at this sport through a linear lens. It's far more difficult to deal with Belal Muhammad's takedown entries than Kamaru Usman's at this stage in their careers, due to the height at which they come, the drive, you know, how hard Belal commits to him, how deep he gets in on the legs, lots of factors. But anyway, this is another position here in round 5 where you see Leon Edwards make a mistake, which again shows how bad his takedown defense is. So when it comes to takedown defense, the best examples I've got of what I'm about to talk about are Joanna Jędrzejczyk and Jose Aldo. Those two fighters probably have the best takedown defense in the history of the UFC. And they were so difficult to take down because their balance was so good, but they were also really, really good at creating wide bases up against the cage. So if you think about a pair of skis, skis are long and wide, right? And the reason why they're long and wide is to keep you upright, enable you to balance yourself when you're skiing by evenly distributing your weight. And if you evenly distribute your weight, it's a lot harder to upset your balance. Same sort of principle applies to creating a wide base up against the cage with takedown defense. So what you're supposed to do when someone shoots in on your legs on a takedown attempt is what you'd see Joanna Jędrzejczyk and Jose Aldo do. Create a nice wide base with their legs, spread their legs out to distribute the weight to make it much harder for your opponent to upset your balance. You think about it, if you're a wide frame, if you're like so for example, if you're the Eiffel Tower, you've been to Paris, you'll know the legs of the Eiffel Tower spread out very, very wide, right? Whereas if you look at a skyscraper, like a Jenga tower, right? Really rigid. If you look at the Eiffel Tower, the weight is evenly distributed on all 4 corners. Whereas if you look at like a skyscraper type structure, as soon as you start attacking that base, because the weight isn't evenly distributed, that tower is just gonna, that skyscraper is just gonna topple over. It's the same sort of principle with taking. You can see it here, right? Look at how close Edwards' legs are together. So when Usman gets in on his legs, it's so easy for Usman to connect his hands around the legs of Leon Edwards and yank his legs out from underneath him, than if Edwards created a nice wide base with his legs and then Usman would have to attack one singular leg, because his arms wouldn't be long enough to wrap his arms around both legs at once and reap Leon's legs out from underneath him. And in that instance, Leon would be able to use the other leg to balance on. Here, Usman can clearly gain control of both legs because Edwards is gifting him both legs. And because of that, I mean, look how close these legs are together. If you go watch footage of Joanna Jędrzejczyk, Jose Aldo, if Aldo was in this position, or if Joanna Jędrzejczyk was in this position, Leon's right leg would be over here by Bisping, and Leon's left leg would be over here by Dominic Cruz. And so Usman would have to make a choice to attack a single leg on either side. He wouldn't be able to get this position. But because Leon gives both legs to Usman, Usman's able to reap his legs out from underneath him, take him down. This is just one example of why Edwards' takedown defense is so fucking bad. Technically, he makes so many mistakes. But again, like we've already said, Edwards is very difficult to hold down because he's so big and strong. So he just stands right back up. Just stands right back up. So now what we're going to do is go to the first fight. Why not? Why not make this breakdown super long? Why not do it? Why not? Who cares? Who cares, right? Why not just make it long? Go into a lot of depth. It still won't sink in for some people, but there are 2 types of people in this world: those who see, those who do not see. We see, motherfuckers. We only deal in facts over here. So let's go into this first round then. There's a lot more grappling from Usman in the first fight. So here we go. All right. So again, we're only focusing on how hard it is to hold Edwards down. So round 1, Edwards falls over. Usman in top position. About 3 minutes 20 seconds left to go in round 1. If we skip through, you can see again, Edwards, when Usman postures up, gets the knee on belly, elevates Usman, started to scramble over the cage, but ultimately just stood back up. Exactly what we saw Luque do to Belal Muhammad. Then Edwards gets top position, very nice. Very nice, very nice. We go into round 2. I think there's about a takedown in every round in this fight from memory. Watched it a few days ago, but I think there's about one takedown every round. Here we go. Here's the one in round 2. So too late in the round for Edwards to try and work his way back up to his feet there. Round 3, I'm pretty sure there's one in round 3. There is. Okay, so here we go. So again, Edwards' legs far too close together. His left leg should be over here by the photographer. His right leg should be over here by whatever this guy's name is, Mike something. And he gets taken down easily as a result. Now, looks very, very weak on the bottom. But as we've said, Edwards is big, strong, very difficult to hold down. So he just gets back up. And they're back to striking. Gets taken down again a few moments later. Gets taken down easily because his takedown offense is a joke. But Edwards, difficult to hold down. If we skip through. This is one of the examples I spoke about when Edwards sometimes just spends way too long hesitating in bad positions. So like here, for example. From like there, Usman doesn't have a lot here. Doesn't have control of any part of Edwards' body. Edwards could have used that as an opportunity to stand back up. But again, it's late in the fight. He's probably tired. Into round 4. Taken down again in round 4. Terrible takedown defense, man. And we just skip through. Again, a couple of minutes later, Edwards is able to stand back up. And from my perspective, Usman is a far stronger, more physically imposing grappler than Belal Muhammad. Round 5, headshot dead. Headshot dead. Headshot dead. Alright. So there we've seen some footage where we know that Edwards is pretty difficult to hold down when you've got a big, strong, physically imposing fighter like Usman on top of him. Now, to be fair, there are a lot of things that Usman could have done to make it much harder for Edwards to work his way back up to his feet. You know, tying the legs up Khabib style, keeping the body lock. You know, one of the things that made Khabib so difficult to deal with is that he always had control of something. He liked to hug you from back control with a body lock, but that meant it was very, very difficult to shake him off because he would wet blanket you. He would stick to you like glue. Now, when you look at the past performances from both guys, let's wrap this up now, right? When you look at the past performances from both guys, it is quite clear that Edwards has a huge advantage on the feet, and based on past performances, it is going to be difficult for Belal Muhammad to hold Leon Edwards down. So based on past performances, I do agree Edwards should be a big favourite. He's very likely to win this weekend, especially when you throw home advantage into the mix. There is one way in which Belal Muhammad could win this fight, or a realistic way in which Belal Muhammad could win this fight. And it could happen. It could happen. It could happen. It wouldn't... So there is one way Belal Muhammad can win this fight, and it would mean him fighting with a style that we've never really seen him use before. It doesn't mean it can't happen. It doesn't mean he can't do it. It just means because he's never done it before, it's unlikely he'll do it this weekend. So, the way in which Muhammad could cause Leon Edwards absolute hell this weekend is if he used the type of style that we occasionally see from Ricky Simone or from Merab Dvalishvili or for a Gregor Gillespie, where Belal Muhammad comes out this weekend, throws game plan and strategy out the window, walks to the octagon in a wrestling singlet and just puts it on Leon Edwards for 5 rounds with a grappling heavy game plan. And he spams takedowns, he persistently grapples. If Edwards stands back up, he tries to keep control of the body off a body lock, or tries to keep Edwards in the clinch up against the cage. And just like a Gregor Gillespie, he hustles, gives Edwards no space and just grapples his balls off for 5 rounds. If Belal Muhammad did that, and I believe he can because he does have an amazing cardio, if Belal Muhammad did that, because Leon Edwards' takedown defense is so bad, I do give Muhammad a decent chance of winning. But it's difficult because Muhammad's never fought with that style before. However, Khabib has. Khabib built a career off that style, spamming takedowns, never-ending relentless grappling. And he's now training with Khabib. Makhachev obviously doesn't fight with that style all the time. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. He certainly didn't in his last fight against Dustin Poirier. But it doesn't mean that he can't. We've seen Makhachev use strategies like that in the past. If Belal comes out this weekend and persistently, relentlessly grapples his absolute bollocks off for 5 rounds, I think he beats Edwards. But he's never really done it before. Belal Muhammad usually just uses his grappling to try and steal rounds. And for that reason, difficult to trust him to do something he's never done before. But the thing is, Belal Muhammad wants to be UFC champion really bad. With how long it took him to get a title shot, he's probably never going to get another title shot again. If he loses this weekend with him being 36 years old, time is against him. So it's a big opportunity. And if he wants to seize this opportunity and win UFC gold, he needs to grapple his absolute bollocks off this weekend. And if he does, with how bad Edwards' takedown offense is, I think he can get the job done. So what does all this mean from a betting point of view? Well, based on past performances, Edwards is definitely the most likely outcome. Having said that, his odds do carry a pretty steep implied probability of 72%. So to get any value on Edwards this weekend, you've got to give him a better than 72% chance of winning, which I don't believe you can do. Even though I do think it's more likely Edwards wins this weekend, at the end of the day, his takedown offense is a joke, and Muhammad's got really good takedowns. So in order for me to be able to bet guys in this odds range, they have to have virtually no way to lose. And that just isn't the case with Leon Edwards, because he's got a big weakness that his opponent is well positioned to exploit. So even though I think Edwards is more likely to win this weekend, his advantages are baked into the odds. I wouldn't bet this. If you do want to bet this fight, you have to take Belal Muhammad. At underdog odds, he gives you the better risk to reward ratio. But the problem with betting Belal Muhammad this weekend is that in order for him to win, I feel he needs to use a game plan and strategy outside of his comfort zone. A game plan and strategy that he doesn't usually use. And while I'm optimistic he may use it now that he's training with Khabib, it's a difficult road to walk being profitable betting the UFC, betting on fighters to use game plans and strategies we've never seen them use before. It's far easier to make money in this game waiting to bet opportunity, or waiting to bet fighters in situations where we know exactly what they're going to do. And if they show up and do what we expect them to do, which is what they always do, they're very, very likely to win. I think betting on consistency is key to being profitable when you bet on the UFC. And as soon as you start hoping fighters will do certain things, even if it makes sense to us, and maybe outside their comfort zone physically or psychologically, they may not be able to do it. So personally, I just avoid betting in situations like that. But, you know, if you really want to bet this fight this weekend to make watching it more interesting, all the value is on Belal Muhammad, in my opinion. Or maybe not all the value. Maybe that's not the right thing to say. But he definitely gives you the better risk to reward ratio. So in terms of the over-under on this fight, obviously, Leon Edwards, absolute decisionator, with the vast majority of his UFC fights going the distance. Same also can be said for Belal Muhammad. And so, pretty likely this fight goes deep. The odds reflect that. Pretty steep favourite odds on fight goes to a decision. They don't get me excited personally, but I think it is more likely this fight goes to a decision. Both guys tough, both well-rounded, both have great cardio. Although if the stats on UFC 204 are anything to go by that we talked about at the beginning of this video, maybe we do get a finish here, since 9 of the 11 fights at UFC 204 did end inside the distance. Now, in terms of props, odds on Edwards by knockout or TKO are pretty short. Not a massive difference in percentage terms from betting Muhammad moneyline to Muhammad by decision. So yeah, I don't really like any props on that. You know, if Muhammad by decision was like 8.0, 9.0, you know, plus 800 in that region, maybe. But not interested, man. Props are a bit dead on that fight. So I hope you found that useful. It's time for us to move on to the next one. So now let's break down the co-main event of this weekend's card, which is going to be Curtis Blaydes versus Tom Aspinall. So we went into tons of depth on the fight between Leon Edwards versus Belal Muhammad, and that's largely down to the fact that there's so much footage available on both guys. We just know so much about them. But we're not going to be able to go into as much depth on the fight between Curtis Blaydes and Tom Aspinall, because despite the fact that Aspinall has worked his way into a title fight this weekend, and despite the fact that he's had so many fights in the UFC, we still don't know anything about this guy. He's pretty much a complete unknown. And as you guys know, my style of betting is to just deal in facts and reality. We're not going to make assumptions, we're not going to guess, we're not going to speculate. And when it comes to Aspinall, for me, the guy is just a complete unknown. He's very, very good in round 1. But what happens if the fight goes past round 1? That would be my question. And so if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Aspinall is one of the biggest favourites on the card, which is super interesting to me considering we don't really know anything about him. He is a 1.27 favourite, which is minus 370 for an implied probability of 79%. If you take a look at the odds on Curtis Blaydes, he's around an average of, say, 3.95, which is going to be plus 295 for an implied probability of 25%. So Blaydes is 33 years old, 6'4" with an 80-inch reach, and Aspinall, 31 years old, 6'5" with a 78-inch reach. So both guys roughly the same age, roughly the same size. So the reason why, for me, this is an impossible fight to bet on is because if we take a look at Aspinall's record, we just don't know anything about him. So he made his debut back in 2020, and that fight lasted 45 seconds. Next fight, minute and a half. Next fight, a minute. Next fight, 2.5 minutes. Bam, 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 bam. You get the idea. All of his fights in the UFC have ended in round 1, with the exception of the Andrei Arlovski fight, which ended early in round 2. The total combined fight time of Tom Aspinall, the total amount of time he spent in a UFC octagon, is around 13 minutes. So all these fights combined, all these 8 fights, add up to about 13 minutes. And obviously, you know, a part of that is because of how good Tom Aspinall is in round 1. He's very, very good. He's a victim of his own success in many ways that we don't know more about him. But for me, with Aspinall being a heavyweight, a big guy that's 6'5", very athletic, obviously guys like Tom Aspinall are very prone to having bad cardio because he moves around a lot and he's a big guy, and big guys that move around a lot very rarely have good cardio. There are a few unicorns like Cyril Gane, but they're very, very rare. So it's possible that Tom Aspinall could be another unicorn, the next generation of heavyweight MMA. It's absolutely possible. But for me, it is totally inconclusive. And the way that people talk about Tom Aspinall is like, you know, he's like a very established UFC fighter and we know everything about him and people talk in great confidence about his capabilities. But my question is, how does Tom Aspinall look if this fight goes to the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th round? How does Tom Aspinall look if he gets hurt? How does Tom Aspinall look if he gets tired? How does Tom Aspinall look if he gets taken down and put on his back? We don't have the answers to any of these questions because we haven't seen him tested in these areas. So on one hand, Tom Aspinall could be the greatest heavyweight fighter to ever live, but on the other hand, he could be one of these fighters that gets hyped up a lot because of all these quick finishes that he's got, and as soon as he gets dragged into deep waters, he gets exposed a little. And without having more footage available on him, we don't know which way it is obviously going to go. The last time we got a really good look at him was all the way back in his fights against Lucas Porobiec and Stuart Austin. In both those fights he looked very bad. In both those fights he did gas out, but they were a long time ago. You know, they were almost 10 years ago now, so it's unfair to judge Tom Aspinall on those fights. We're not going to bring them up. They're irrelevant. They're fights that took place 10 years ago, but that's really how far back you have to go. And obviously, you know, they don't tell us a lot about where Aspinall is in 2024. So this fight is an impossible one to bet on for me. Too many unanswered questions. When it comes to betting on MMA, when we don't have answers to questions and we've got to make assumptions as to a certain fighter's strengths and weaknesses, what I like to do is just deal in most likely outcomes, and I tend to look at the trends. So with Tom Aspinall being 6'5", with a 78-inch reach, and him training at a gym like Team Cowbon, I'm just going to make some assumptions about Tom Aspinall's strengths and weaknesses based on most likely outcomes based on that information, right? So if we talk about how this fight is likely to play out standing up and on the ground, and again, I'm just going to be dealing with most likely outcomes from a very limited amount of footage on Tom Aspinall. So if this fight stays standing, we know that Aspinall moves very well on the feet. He's very accurate with his striking. He's got true legit knockout power, which poses a threat to Curtis Blaydes, who's obviously a little bit stiff on the feet, not the best defensively, has a long history of being rocked, wobbled, and knocked out in fights. And early in the fight, you would imagine that Blaydes would be in a lot of trouble on the feet. Aspinall moves like a fighter that competes in a much lighter weight class. His striking is very fluid. If we're dealing in most likely outcomes, though, when you look at Aspinall, he uses a lot of footwork and movement. He bounces around a lot. He's light on his feet, and that's what makes his striking so good. Or one of the things that makes his striking so good. It is extremely rare that a heavyweight fighter, a man that weighs 265 pounds, can move like that and be really light on his feet for more than a couple of rounds without starting to gas out bad. So Aspinall could be a unicorn that can fight with lots of footwork and movement and explosiveness and power and speed for 25 minutes, but it's very unlikely based on most likely outcomes, based on trends within heavyweight MMA. So if Blaydes can make it out the first 2 rounds on the feet, this fight gets very, very interesting for me, because if Aspinall starts to slow, we know that Blaydes gassed a bit against Alexander Volkov, but outside of that, Curtis Blaydes' cardios look really good for a heavyweight. Now, when it comes to grappling, it's very interesting because Curtis Blaydes is one of the best MMA grapplers in the heavyweight division. After John Jones, he might be the best. And we know he's got good offensive wrestling, good grappling control, decent enough cardio to grapple hard for 25 minutes. Now, that makes this fight interesting because Tom Aspinall has never had to face a guy that's really committed hard to taking him down. We've never seen Aspinall defend a takedown. We've never seen him on his back. And now he's thrown into a title fight against one of the best MMA grapplers in the division. So there are a lot of ways that makes this fight interesting. The first being, we've already spoken about how Aspinall at 6'5", 265 pounds, is very likely to slow down a lot as the fight wears on, with how his style relies on speed and movement. And obviously, even if Blaydes doesn't have success with his grappling early on, forcing Aspinall to grapple, forcing him to defend takedowns could wear Aspinall out, which would make his striking less effective. And also, you've got to consider where Aspinall is from. So if we think about Aspinall, right, he's a very high level, very well-rounded fighter, but he's also from the UK, and he also trains at Team Cowbon, which is a gym that has a reputation for having very bad MMA grapplers, with the exception of Mike Grundy, who came from a traditional wrestling background. But outside of that, Team Cowbomb fighters have a bit of a reputation for having bad takedown defense and bad ground games. So, for all we know, Tom Aspinall could be another Darren Till. Where if you remember Darren Till, he's a very dynamic striker, very dangerous striker. One of the, considered one of the best middleweights in the world for a good chunk of his career. He was floating around that title picture at one point when he fought Robert Whittaker on Fight Island. And then his takedown defense and ground game got exposed badly. And we saw Darren Till for the level of fighter he truly was. We could see the same thing with Tom Aspinall. Tom Aspinall could be the greatest heavyweight of all time. But at the same time, it's possible he has no takedown defense and no ground game because we've never seen him defend a takedown. And now he's a big favourite against the best MMA grappler next to John Jones in the division. So, when it comes to the odds, this is a very, very, very interesting fight for me. I think Tom Aspinall is a terrible bet this weekend. There are so many unanswered questions over him. And if you bet him, his odds are carrying an implied probability of 79%. In order to get any value here, you have to give Tom Aspinall a better than 80% chance of winning, which is utterly impossible when you consider we don't know anything about his cardio. We don't know what he's like on the bottom. We don't know what his takedown defense is like. We don't know how he's going to look in the 3rd, 4th and 5th rounds. We literally barely know anything about this guy other than he's a very dangerous striker in the 1st round. But what happens if Curtis Blaydes weathers the storm? How is Aspinall going to look in round 3? That would be my question. And so, from where I am, I mean, it's speculative, but, Curtis Blaydes doesn't come with a terrible risk to reward ratio. Now, it doesn't mean anything if he gets knocked out in round 1, but if he comes in with a grappling heavy game plan, this one could get very, very, very interesting. So let me know what you think about this one on the Discord or in the YouTube comments. Whenever I break down a fight like this, it is really funny because there's tons of people that are like, Aspinall's going to do this, he's going to do that. They talk so confidently. And my answer is always the same. Show me the footage. Show me the facts. Show me the concrete evidence of what Aspinall can do in rounds 3, 4 and 5. Because it doesn't exist. So when you talk really confidently about a fight like this, you're lying to yourself and you're talking shit. Because there's no evidence of Tom Aspinall's strengths and weaknesses past the first 5 minutes of a fight. I mean, the only evidence we have got is from 10 years ago, and he looked terrible in rounds 2 of both those fights. So, be interesting to see how this plays out. What I really hope is that it goes deep, and we do see Aspinall tested in that 3rd, 4th and 5th round, so we get to learn a little bit more about him in the same way we got to learn more about Joe Pyfer when he fought that 5-round main event against Jack Hermanson, and we saw Hermanson drag him into deep waters. Aspinall's in a similar spot this weekend, very similar to Joe Pyfer going into that Jack Hermanson fight. We need to see what this guy's capable of, because right now he's a complete unknown. Yes, he's very, very good in the 1st round. Let's see what happens in a 5-round fight. Who knows? So that's how I see this one. If you want to bet this fight this weekend, it is clearly dog or pass. You have to take Curtis Blaydes. You'd have to be a crazy person to bet, Aspinall at these odds in any capacity. These odds are outrageous. Absolutely outrageous. So, Curtis Blaydes, very, very tempting bet this weekend. Let's take a look at the over-under. So, obviously, what's interesting about this fight is that one of the reasons why it's so difficult for betting is because the total combined fight time on Aspinall's 8 fights in the UFC is around 13 minutes. So, on that basis, pretty unlikely this fight goes to a decision, because Aspinall's never been to a decision. The odds are very steep on any kind of under in this fight. Even the odds on under 2.5 rounds are unplayable. This is not something that I'm going to be betting myself, because Blaydes is bad defensively and Aspinall does come out the gate very aggressive and he is very dangerous on the feet. What he did to Pavlovich was very impressive. But if you really, really, really want to bet an over-under on this fight, I would take the over. just on the base that Blaydes gets his grappling going early, maybe get some clinch work from him, you know, some takedown attempts on Aspinall. Maybe Aspinall starts a bit slower to pace himself in such a big 5-rounder for a title. And so maybe for the first time we see an Aspinall fight go over the 7.5 minute mark in the UFC. The only reason why I'm saying that, though, and again, I'm not going to be betting it myself, I just think I'd rather take underdog odds on over 7.5 minutes than steep favourite odds on the under 7.5 minutes. But I don't feel particularly great about either. I don't think either is a particularly good bet. So in terms of the prop bets on this one, I mean, that's kind of crazy, right? Blaydes by decision. Imagine if he just takes Aspinall down, grinds him out in front of the UK fans for 25 minutes. Wouldn't that be interesting? Or gets a late stoppage through ground and pound. 41.0, 34.0. Look, it's very difficult to predict. Or it's very difficult to cook up a prop for this fight. Because ultimately, you know, there's a lot we don't know about Aspinall, which makes it difficult to feel super confident in the outcome of this one. So there's loads of props you could consider. Rather than going for like the really chalked, steep favourite odds on something like Aspinall by knockout or TKO, I would look to go for the more speculative bets on things like Aspinall to win in rounds 4 and 5, or Aspinall to win by decision, just based on the fact that Aspinall may not be as good as people think he is if you can drag him outside of the first round. Those are the kind of things I would be looking at. I know that's contrarian, but I always let the odds do the work for me. While I do think it's more likely Aspinall wins, Aspinall's perceived advantages are very, very much baked into the odds. In fact, they're overly baked into the odds. So you've got to look for the more outside kind of bets on this one and look to get things with a better risk to reward ratio. You guys know me. I don't touch fights like this where there are so many unanswered questions. So it's not for me, but it might be for you. Let me know what you think. Now let's break down one of the most interesting fights on this card and one of the best fights for betting as well, which is going to be Paddy Pimblett versus Bobby Green. Now, this is an amazing fight for live betting. I can't wait to dive into this one. It's also a pretty good fight for pre-fight betting. I'm very, 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 very tempted to bet one of the guys in this matchup, and I need your help in giving me your opinions to get me over the line on it. So if you're in my Discord community, let me know how you feel about this fight on Discord. If you're not, please drop a comment below. I read all your comments. I try to respond to as many comments as possible. Some weeks I don't get the time, but I really appreciate you if you leave a comment. It means a lot. So as much as from a betting point of view, I absolutely love fights like this, I do hate breaking down fights like this, because whenever you've got a matchup like this, which a lot of people within the MMA community hold strong opinions on, I will face a lot of criticism and abuse no matter what I say. Whether I absolutely nail this breakdown or not, there will be a large group of people that disagree with everything that I've got to say. And because you've got a camp of people that very strongly believe Bobby Green's going to win this, and they're very set in their beliefs on that. And you've got a camp of people that feel very strongly Paddy Pimblett will win this, and they're very steep on their beliefs as to the reasons why. All I would say to you, if you are very clearly in one camp or the other, is all the information that I'm going to be sharing with you now relating to this fight is just based on reality and what we've seen in the past fights of both these guys. So I'm not coming out here plucking crazy opinions out of my head. All I've done this week is sit in my pants, spend a couple of hours watching the last few fights from Bobby Green, the last few fights from Paddy Pimblett, and as I break this fight down, all I'm doing is summarising to you what has actually happened in their past fights and stylistically what that means for both of them as they now face one another. So what I tend to find with fights like this is if people feel super confident on either side, they often haven't done their research properly. So I really hope for those of you more level-headed down the middle, I hope you will find this breakdown very useful, because I do think it is a great fight for betting. I'm very tempted to bet Bobby Green. I'll come outright and say it right now. This is an incredible stylistic matchup for Bobby Green for the reasons that I will go through in this breakdown. I also think this is potentially one of the easiest fights of Bobby Green's entire UFC career, so long as he fights smart this weekend. Unfortunately, Bobby Green has built a career off not fighting particularly smart, which is Paddy's best chance of winning this weekend if Bobby, makes some really bad decisions in this fight. And we're going to go into all that in a lot more depth. But first of all, we need to start off by taking a look at the odds. So both these guys are in the even money odds range. Green, the slight favourite at the moment. The odds have jumped around all over the place and they continue to move. But currently, Bobby Green is at an average of about 1.85, which is going to be minus 118 for an implied probability of 54%. If we take a look at the odds on Paddy Pimblett, he's around an average of 1.95, which is going to be minus 105 for an implied probability of 51%. So Bobby Green is 37 years old, 5'10", with a 71-inch reach. Paddy Pimblett, 29 years old, 5'10", with a 73-inch reach. So there are a few X factors we need to dig into. The first is obviously not that relevant because they're both about the same size, but there is a big difference in age. We can see that Paddy Pimblett is 8 years younger than Bobby Green, and statistically that gives him around about a 67% chance of winning. So the younger fighter wins around 67% of the time when there's an 8-year age gap in a fight. And at 29 years old, Paddy Pimblett should be making big improvements from fight to fight, whereas at 37 years old, Bobby Green's going to be 38 in a couple of months. He should be declining significantly from fight to fight. On top of that, he's had almost 50 pro fights. He spent a lot of time in the octagon. He's a total opposite from Tom Aspinall. He has spent a lot of time in the octagon. We know a lot about Bobby Green. He's been in a lot of wars. He's taken a lot of damage. He's had a lot of injuries. So there's a lot of wear and tear on Green's body. So Green fits the profile of someone that should be on a very steep decline, and old fighters find ways to lose. Having said that, from a technical point of view, in terms of speed and reflexes and sharpness, I don't think we've seen any decline in Bobby Green in recent years. I think that I think some of Bobby Green's performances over the last couple of years have been some of the best of his career. The Hack-Harass performance in particular was amazing. However, one physical aspect of Bobby Green where we've seen decline is in his durability. So Bobby Green was a guy that built a career off having a granite chin and incredible durability, and a guy that was virtually impossible to finish. He's had, I think that's about 48 pro fights. I haven't got my calculator out, but I'm pretty sure that's 48 pro fights. In his 48 pro fights, he's only been KO'd 1, 2, 3. He's only been KO'd 3 times in 48 pro fights, which is extremely impressive when you consider that he's been competing against some of the best fighters in the world for pretty much his entire career. Even, in smaller promotions like King of the Cage, he was fighting, a decent level of opponent in guys like Charles Bennett, Darren Cruikshank, Tim Means, Jesus Cavalcante. These are all decent lightweights back in the day. And then obviously he went into Strikeforce, and then shortly after into the UFC. So there's not really been a time in Green's career where he's been competing against lower level guys on the regional circuit outside of like his first 10 fights. So the fact he's only been KO'd 3 times in the last 48 fights is extremely impressive. However, a subtle sign of decline is that 2 of his losses by knockout have come in his last 6 pro fights, right? So in his first 42 pro fights, he was only KO'd 1 time by Dustin Poirier, but then he's been KO'd twice in his last 6. And we've seen him wobbled and dropped a few times in recent fights as well. So in terms of Green's decline, skill for skill, in terms of technique, in terms of sharpness, I think he's probably the best he's ever been, but definitely not as durable as he used to be. That chin is starting to go, which is not a great surprised after 48 pro fights and being 38 years old and taking all that damage. So that's something we've got to think about. Paddy's very tough, very durable. Scousers don't get knocked out, lad. They don't fucking get knocked out, yeah? So we know Paddy is very fucking durable. He's tough. He's got a good chin. We know this. In fact, has he ever been knocked out? I don't think he has. No, Paddy's never been knocked out. But obviously he's faced a much lower level of opponent throughout his career than Bobby has throughout his career. So it's not a fair comparison. But still, 0 knockouts in 24 fights. Maybe Scousers don't get fucking knocked out, lad. You know what I mean? Maybe Paddy's fucking right, yeah? So, interesting. So, those are the major X factors to talk about outside of the obvious that Paddy Pimblett has got home advantage on his side this weekend in a big way. The crowd are going to be behind him big time. Manchester is only a short drive away from Paddy's hometown of Liverpool. And I remember back when Paddy was the Cage Warriors champion and he would fight in the Echo Arena in Liverpool. Like, I think there was only a relatively small crowd, like 5,000 in there, but it sounded like 50,000. Paddy's really going to have the fans behind him on Saturday night. Home advantage is going to be huge, and it's obviously not going to be easy for Bobby Green to win a decision in the UK against one of the most popular UK fighters, one of the UK's cash cows, and especially when the crowd are going to be behind Paddy big time. Oh, Paddy the baddie, it's going to be litty on Saturday night. That crowd's going to be nuts. Although it will be about 4 or 5 a.m. in the morning local time by the time Paddy walks, so maybe everyone will be asleep by that time. But I have actually been to an event many years ago in Sweden. I don't know what the number was, but it was the UFC event in Stockholm when Anthony Johnson fought Alexander Gustafsson, and the UFC did the same time. They adjusted the start time of the event for US broadcasting, so by the time Anthony Johnson and Gustafsson fought in the main event, which was about 5 a.m. local time, tons of people had left the arena, and that meant there were empty seats spread throughout the stadium, and there were literally people sleeping across rows of empty seats. So if you think about it, the stadium at the start of the event was sold out, but then so many people left. You had rows of 5, 6, 7 seats free, and there would be people literally just sleeping on those seats before the main event started. So it's a strange vibe going to one of these European events that are broadcast, or European events that start at 11 p.m. midnight and run till 5, 6, 7 a.m. in the morning. It's strange vibes. I've been to one in Sweden. Ironically, I'm from the UK. I haven't been to one in the UK, but that's mainly because obviously we've got the live betting group and I have to live bet now, which makes it difficult to go to UFC events. But before I had those commitments, I used to go to UFC events, and it's a strange vibe, these events in the middle of the night. Anyway, back to this fight. Bobby Green versus Paddy Pimblett. So those are all the X factors. Home advantage is likely to be absolutely huge. So, how do these two match up from a stylistic point of view? Why do I see Bobby Green as being such a tempting bet this weekend? Well, fundamentally, when you look at how both these guys match up from a stylistic point of view, Bobby Green is significantly better than Paddy Pimblett in every single aspect of MMA, to the point where I don't give Paddy a clear or definitive advantage over Bobby anywhere. Bobby is levels and levels and levels and levels above Paddy everywhere, in my opinion. He is just supremely skilled, so far above Paddy that he's in a different galaxy. So let's break this down. And we'll start off with the most simple aspect of this fight to talk about, which is grappling. Because obviously Paddy is predominantly a grappler. He's at his most dangerous on the ground. He's got very slick back takes. He's got quite a good deal of physicality to his grappling and ground game as well. If you've watched my breakdown for the fight between Belal Muhammad and Leon Edwards, we were talking about how when it comes to MMA grapplers, fighters often have this trade-off, right? Where they either have, they either have the ability to grapple hard for a long period of time and they have amazing cardio, but then they lack physicality and strong grappling control because they sacrifice that physicality, that athleticism for the great gas tank. Or they tend to be an MMA grappler who have an abundance of physicality, great grappling control, but because they're so strong and physically imposing, they don't have that cardio, and all that strength means that they burn through a lot of energy. And whereas Belal Muhammad fits into the camp of fighter who has great cardio, great persistent grappling, but not very good grappling control, not much physicality on the ground, Paddy's in the opposite camp where he's very strong, he's very physically imposing. He does have an abundance of physicality to his grappling, but that comes at a cost, and he slows down a lot when he just grapples a little bit. Paddy doesn't really have the cardio to grapple hard for 3 rounds, which is very limiting for him because when he gets tired, he's very bad at everything. So Paddy's in this difficult position where he's got a decent ground game, but he can't use it for very long because he gasses himself out when he uses it. So, in my opinion, based on past performances, it is very, very, very unlikely that Paddy is going to have any success with his grappling in this fight. He may have a bit of success in round 1 when he's full of energy. You know, he might catch Bobby Green flat-footed, land a takedown, get the back control quickly. But past round 1, I don't give Paddy much of a chance of having any success with his grappling at all. And this is because Bobby Green is foundationally a wrestler. So Bobby Green started his career as a wrestler, and then like, you know, a lot of old school MMA fighters like Chuck Liddell, for example, Bobby built on top of that base in wrestling, you know, a style of MMA striking where he's now very much a striker, but his original base was wrestling. And because of that, Bobby Green's takedown offense is absolutely excellent, and he's very, very difficult to hold down and control. Bobby Green has had 48 pro fights, and the only guy that I've ever seen able to take Green down and hold him down was Islam Makhachev. I don't recall ever seeing anyone else have that much success taking Green down and holding him down. Will Paddy be the second guy ever to do it? Maybe, but it's not very likely. It's a less probable outcome. And the thing about Bobby Green is he's a cardio machine. His takedown offense is just as good in round 3 as it is in round 1. So while Paddy may be able to have a little bit of success with his grappling in the first round if he catches Bobby Green cold and flat-footed and hits a takedown out of nowhere that he commits hard to, remember what I said, Paddy is one of these guys that burns through a lot of energy very quickly when he grapples. He slows down a lot when he grapples. And so Bobby Green's takedown offense is so good, and his ability to scramble back to his feet is so good, that after round 1, when Paddy slows a bit, I just don't think Paddy's going to have the energy to take Green down and hold him down. You really need to be a high-level grappler with crushing grappling control to be able to take Bobby Green down and hold him down. And Pimblett just ain't it. He might be for a few minutes. He's not for 15 minutes. So I think we may see Paddy with some grappling in round 1, but after the first round, Paddy is going to be forced to stand and strike. And that is where this fight can become extremely problematic for Paddy Pimblett. Like, very, very bad. So when we look at how these two match up when it comes to striking, Bobby Green's fights are always very difficult to read because he does screw around a lot. When Bobby Green is at his absolute best, he's got good footwork, he's got good movement. Even though he fights with his hands down low, his head movement is very, very good. He's got a brilliant jab, he throws a high volume of strikes, he's very elusive on the feet, and he's very, very good at pressuring his opponents into an uncomfortable range and just peppering them with a high volume of strikes that are difficult to deal with. That is when Bobby Green is at his absolute best. If you want to see Bobby Green at his absolute best, go watch his fight against Nasrat Haqparast. Haqparast is a good boxer, a very good boxer, a far better boxer than Paddy Pimblett, and Haqparast couldn't lay a glove on Green, couldn't get near him. Green took control of the centre of the octagon, maintained pressure through a high volume of strikes, and outclassed Haqparast for 3 rounds. If Bobby Green shows up and performs like that this weekend, Paddy Pimblett has virtually no chance of winning. Absolutely virtually no chance. If Green shows up and performs with his full potential, Paddy is absolutely screwed. The problem with Bobby Green is that his career has been held back by him not performing to his full potential far too often. and he often doesn't perform to his full potential in high stakes fights where he can really advance his career. So some of the issues that have defined Bobby Green throughout his entire career and held him back is bad fight IQ, where he will have long periods of inactivity in fights, or take entire rounds off, or start very slowly, which is unnecessary because he's got great cardio, right? When you see Bobby Green take 2-3 minutes off without really letting his hands go, or take an entire round off, it doesn't make sense because we know he's got the cardio to fight hard, go hard, throw strikes for 15 minutes, no problem. But long periods of inactivity have cost Bobby Green at critical moments in fights where he really needed to win just that one round to take a decision, or to put his stamp on a round or stamp on a fight, and he just eases off the gas and he allows his opponent back into the fight, and he allows the fight to become closer than it needed to be. Those are issues which have defined Bobby Green's career. And if we really get specific with it, a big issue with Bobby Green is that he often starts very, very slowly. So Green is one of these guys that will often not perform that well in round one, and we've seen this in some of his recent fights against Jim Miller and Tony Ferguson, where he struggled in the first round. Takes Green a little bit of time to get warmed up, a little bit of time to find his range, and then when he finds his range and starts to let his hands go and get in that flow state, he's devastating. But he does have a habit of losing the first round, and the problem with that is Paddy Pimblett is the opposite, right? Bobby Green starts slow and usually finishes very strong. Paddy starts strong and usually finishes very slow. So you'd expect Paddy Pimblett to win the first round of this fight. He's going to come out the gate hard. You look at the Vendramini fight. In fact, you look at the first round of Ferguson versus Paddy. Paddy's very, very aggressive in round one. Bobby Green does have a habit of getting caught cold. Green's the kind of guy where if you're going to cause him big problems, you need to do it in round one. You need to take him down and overwhelm him in round one before he's had a chance to warm up, or you need to catch him with a big shot and knock him out in round one. Because if you let him settle into a rhythm, find his range, get comfortable in there, he's a nightmare to deal with in the second and third rounds. But the worst round of the fight for Bobby Green just so happens to be the best round of the fight for Paddy. So that's an issue for Bobby, because I don't expect him to win round one, which reduces the probability of him winning this fight, because if he loses the first round in order to take a decision, he's got to definitively win rounds 2 and 3 against a guy like Paddy Pimblett, who we know is going to have the crowd behind him, who we know has got home advantage, and we know who it'll be difficult to win a decision against. So those are some issues with Bobby. Inactivity, taking rounds off, starting slow. You okay, babe? Another big problem with Bobby Green is, how do I describe this? It's fucking around. So Bobby Green also does this thing quite often in big fights where the crowd are behind, the crowd are reacting to the fighters, and there's a good atmosphere, which obviously we're going to have with this event. Bobby Green does this thing where it's like he doesn't really understand how MMA fights are scored. And we've heard Bobby Green complain about this over the years when he's lost close decisions. But he does this thing where he allows his opponent to hit him to prove to the judges that they can't hurt him. But what he doesn't realise when he does this is, by allowing his opponents to hit him, his opponents are scoring points. And by him taking the shot or rolling with the punch and then kind of like brushing his shoulders off and signalling to the judges that it didn't hurt him, he's not scoring points for that. Like, he's allowing his opponent to score points, but he does it a lot in high profile fights. And in some fights he does it a lot. Like a lot. Like, if he doesn't respect his opponent on the feet and has total disdain for them, sometimes he'll do this thing where he kind of walks them down and just allows them to punch him in the face, and he'll like roll with the punches and he'll like slip him and brush his shoulders off and stuff. But when he's doing that, because he's so focused on making the point that his opponent can't hurt them, he doesn't throw anything because he's so focused on like using Wing Chun and stuff to fuck about and be defensive. But obviously when you're being defensive, you're not scoring points. So this is a big issue with Bobby Green that has cost him in past fights. And this is why I reference his performance against Nasrat Haqparast, because there wasn't any of that. There wasn't any fucking about. He literally just put it on Haqparast for 3 rounds, and it was a brilliant performance. And tying in with what I've just described, another issue that has plagued Bobby Green throughout his career is showboating. And again, when the stakes are high and the atmosphere in the arena is good and the fans are interacting with the fighters as the fight is taking place, he's far more likely to do this. And we know the crowd on Saturday night are going to be incredible, right? But Bobby Green has this bad habit of showboating where he will kind of talk shit and he'll point at fighters, and again he'll allow them to hit him and he'll roll with the punches and screw about. But when he's doing all this, he doesn't really throw anything or attack or score points. So all of the stuff I've just described is ways in which Bobby Green fucks around to make fights closer than they need to be. So when I say Bobby Green is significantly better than Paddy Pimblett in every single aspect of MMA, I mean it, because it's the truth. It's facts. You look at the past fighters. You look at their past fights, it should be glaringly obvious to anyone with eyeballs. But the problem with Bobby is he quite often doesn't show up and perform to his full potential. And he can't afford to do that this weekend, because we know if this fight turns out to be remotely close, or if the rounds turn out to be remotely close, very likely Paddy will get the hometown judging, the hometown decisions. And it'll be hard for Bobby Green to win a decision in Manchester on the weekend against Paddy. Paddy's already won a terrible robbery against Jared Gordon. I have a feeling Bobby might be the next victim. But skill for skill, if Bobby Green shows up and performs like he did against Haqparast, I think he stops Paddy late. Because I think it'll reach a point where Paddy will be too tired to defend himself on the feet. He doesn't have the defensive boxing of a Jim Miller or a Nasrat Haqparast to hang in there. Paddy is sloppy on the feet, bad defensively, has bad cardio, and will not be able to take 100 to 200 jabs in the face from Bobby Green. So if Bobby Green does show up and perform to his full potential, how do I see this fight playing out, right? If you said to me, I've got a crystal ball, Chris, I promise you, Paddy and Bobby are both going to show up and perform to their full potential this weekend. You're going to get exactly what you expect from both of them, exactly what we've seen from them in the past when they're at their best. How does this fight go? The way I think this fight goes is Paddy comes out aggressive in round 1. I don't think Bobby has much success in the first round. I think Paddy might shoot some takedowns. I think he'll blitz forward with big winging hook combinations that might catch Bobby with some big shots and hurt him. Maybe even knocks Bobby down. I think round 1 will be kind of chaotic and frantic because Bobby isn't a power striker. Obviously, he did knock Grant Dawson out, but generally speaking, Bobby is a volume striker. We know Paddy's got a good chin. So I don't think Bobby's going to have tons of success in the first round. I think Paddy will probably use his physicality, his strength, his power to kind of overwhelm Bobby, either standing up or on the ground in round 1. In the round 2, though, when Bobby has started to find his range, and when Bobby has started to find his range and Paddy starts to slow a bit, I think when you start to see Bobby get his jab going, I think this is where you'll see Paddy in a lot of trouble. And if Bobby throws a similar volume of strikes in rounds 2 and 3 to what he threw against Jim Miller and Nasrat Haqparast, I think he will likely stop Paddy late on, sometime in round 3, simply because Paddy is a bit of a sitting duck on the feet. Doesn't move his head, doesn't move particularly well, is sloppy. When he gets tired, his footwork goes out the window. He just becomes a bit of a sitting duck on the feet. And I think he'll be too tired to get Bobby down in the second and third round. And I think he'll just fade hard under Bobby's pressure. But in order for the fight to play out like that, Bobby has to perform to his full potential. If he starts showboating and fucking around and complaining to the referee to separate them, if Paddy gets tired and drives him into the cage and tries to run the clock down in the clinch, then Bobby invites the judges to score the fight in favour of Paddy, because Bobby's really going to need to put it on Paddy this weekend to win a decision, and in big fights he often doesn't. So yeah, that's how I see this fight going, essentially. What I will say is this: if Paddy does win this fight, I would be surprised if he dominated. If Paddy wins this fight, I think he'll win a close hometown decision, a close split decision, something like that. I would be extremely surprised if Paddy were to win this dominantly and decisively. I just don't think he's good enough. At best, if you're betting Paddy this weekend, he wins a close decision. People talking about Paddy knocking Bobby out and stuff in round 1. It could happen. Bobby does have a habit of getting dinged, but I think far more likely outcome here is this fight goes deep and Bobby weathers the early storm. I don't think Paddy's as dangerous as people make out, if I'm being brutally honest with you. He went to a 3-round decision against a geriatric Tony Ferguson, so how dangerous can he really be? I think it's a very good fight for Bobby Green stylistically, and I think if he shows up and performs to his full potential, I think he absolutely dominates Paddy. The only final thing that I want to show you is something that I should have played at the beginning of the breakdown when we went through the X factors, but I completely forgot, so we'll do it now instead. It's just this 2-minute clip of Paddy Pimblett talking about issues that he has had suffering with depression going into this camp. So I'm just going to play this video for you now, and then we'll talk about what it means in the context of this fight after we're done playing it. So here we go.
About 5 or 6 weeks ago, my coach was thinking about pulling me out. You know what I mean? Where mentally, I weren't there, and I said a couple of weeks ago, I think this is going to be the worst fight camp of my life, and up until like 2 or 3 weeks ago, it was.
How did you turn it around?
I don't know. I really don't. I've got that attitude, lad, and that positivity where I can turn it around, and you know how confident I am. So when my coach thought about pulling me out, I was like, no chance. You know what I mean? Then you've got to stay confident, lad. You've got to stay positive. You know what I mean? Whenever I start feeling negative and get a bit down, that's when I hit a bit of depression, and mentally, that side of things, it's hard. You know what I mean? As I say, I wasn't in the best place like 5 weeks ago, something like that. I actually messaged James's place, the place where I go to have a little bit of counselling. I actually messaged Jane, the woman who I go and see, and was like, can I come and see you? You know what I mean? Just to have a little chat and feel better.
That's pretty remarkable that you're happy to share this sort of thing with us.
I need to share this, lad, because other people don't. And I'm probably going to mention it again in the cage after a win, lad, because the amount I'm hearing it again lately. Like 2 years ago when I mentioned it, like obviously Andy Mann's club, James's place, all them places said that the surge in calls what they got, and the Samaritans and stuff like that, the surge in calls what they got of people actually speaking up.
How important is it for you that this is a pivotal part of your career, that this is a role you're happy to take on as somebody who's going to speak out and encourage others to speak out as well?
Yeah, that's like, people always say to me, oh, it's amazing what you're doing, that, lad. I'm just doing my part, lad. I think anyone in my position who's got a couple of followers, who's got a bit of a platform, they should be doing this.
All right, so obviously a bit of a red flag with Paddy Pimblett going into the fight this weekend, if you're thinking about betting him, is that he said in that interview that he has battled with depression for this training camp to the extent that his coach was basically wanting to pull him out of this fight this weekend. So that's a huge issue for me for 3 reasons. The first reason being, obviously, when you're depressed, it's going to be very difficult to find the motivation to get up every day and train. So when we're talking about a fighter like Paddy Pimblett that has pretty bad cardio, if he hasn't trained as hard as he usually does leading up to this fight because the depression has made it difficult for him to find the motivation to get up and train, then obviously his cardio could look worse than ever this weekend, which is a big problem against someone like Bobby Green, who obviously has the ability to fight at a very high pace. The second reason why this is a big red flag is he must have been in a pretty bad way if his coach wanted to pull him out of the fight about a month ago. Either he's in a very bad state in terms of not being in good enough shape for this fight, which means his cardio could look really bad, like we just said, or mentally isn't in, a good place to go and compete in his underwear in a cage fight to the death with millions of people watching, right? Maybe his coach is worried that if he loses, his depression and mental health will spiral to a really dark place, which no one wants to see. So that's another red flag, right? He must be in a pretty bad way if his coach is considering pulling him out of the fight. The third reason why this is a big red flag for betting Paddy is because if he is depressed, you've got to question what his motivation is like coming into this fight. He's talked about it fueling him. But at the same time, it's a bit of a contradiction, right? Because we know in order to compete at this level, be one of the best fighters in the world, you have to be hungry, motivated, train your ass off, and have laser focus on your goal. You have to be totally committed to it. And so the interview is contradictory because on one hand, Paddy's talking about depression, which we know will lead to a lack of motivation to train, a lack of drive. But on the other hand, he kind of wants to come in and prove it can be done. And we know at the highest level, this is a game of inches. You've got to be on point. You've got to do everything right. And Paddy's depression leading into this fight will make it very difficult for him to do everything right. Yeah, to keep his diet on track, to show up every day and train, to train the best of his ability, to work hard. It's going to be hard, really, really hard. We've got to be realistic. And at the same time, we talk about how the depression will make it difficult to raise your game and be motivated for this fight. It'll also be difficult to be motivated within the fight, right? We've spoken about how home advantage is huge because it motivates, it energizes fighters. They can feed off the energy of the crowd. It makes it easier for home fighters to dig deep when the going gets tough, when they get hurt, when they get tired. But if Paddy gets tired in this fight, if he gets put in a bad position, if he gets hurt, will the depression make it more likely that he will quit? Because he doesn't have that same drive to keep going, keep pushing? Who knows? I don't know. And this is a horrible thing for us to talk about, but ultimately we have to talk about it because it's my job to try and find strong positions to put my money, try and make money betting on the sport of MMA. Paddy's talked about this. It's a big, big, big factor in how this fight will play out. So we've got to talk about it too. Be keen to know what you think. Let me know on Discord if you're in the Discord community, or leave a comment if you're watching this on YouTube. That for me is a huge red flag if you're betting Bobby this weekend. And yeah, man, tough times. I feel really bad for Paddy. It is horrible what he's going through. It's horrible, man. Hopefully he comes out on top. Hopefully it works out for him. And I'm sure a win on Saturday night would give him a big lift. So, yeah, to wrap everything up that we've said, I'm very, very, very tempted to bet Bobby this week. I haven't made my mind up on it yet because I don't like betting on old fighters and I don't like betting on inconsistent fighters. Bobby Green is both old and he is inconsistent. But this is a very good stylistic matchup for him. Very, very, very good stylistic matchup. So he's extremely tempting. Obviously, if you're in the Discord group, I will let you guys know in the pre-fight betting channel if I pull the trigger on him or not. But this is just one where obviously we perform really well betting on the UFC. And the reason why we perform so well is because we've got certain principles we stick to that we do not break. We don't bet on older fighters when they're facing young, hungry bulls. And we don't bet on fighters who are inconsistent. And usually when we break one of those principles, we lose. I don't think we've ever had the situation where we've broken two of those principles, because breaking one of those principles is very difficult for me to do, so I don't do it very often. So the smart thing for us to do here is to probably pass, but Bobby is so fucking tempting, man. He is so tempting. he's very, very, very tempting. It's a great fight for him. So, in terms of the over-under on this, very likely the fight goes to a decision, or at least deep, in my opinion. We can see the odds reflect that, with fight going to a decision favoured. Obviously, Bobby, even though his last few fights have ended inside the distance, for the longest time he was a decisionator. If you look at Paddy, we already said he's not that dangerous. His last two have gone to a decision. He got finishes against a few low-level of opponents, but back in Cage Warriors, as he faced that step up in competition in Cage Warriors, his fights frequently went to a decision as well. So I do think it's more likely that this fight will go to a decision, but the odds aren't great on it, especially because Paddy comes out the gate very hard in round one, so maybe he catches Bobby with a big shot and knocks him out in round one, or because Paddy is likely to gas in this fight and maybe Bobby gets a stoppage later on in round three. So if I were betting this, the over-under on this, I would personally prefer to take fight doesn't go to a decision at slight underdog odds, just because I like the odds better than going for the favorite odds on fight goes to a decision. But I could see it going either way. Both guys are tough, both are durable. It's likely to go deep, more likely to go deep. But with Paddy's cardio and the fact Green tends to get dinged early in fights, I could see a finish as well. So I won't be betting that. In terms of most likely outcome, I think Bobby Green to win by decision is most likely outcome, but the odds are very short. And so if you really want to bet this fight, I would just take Bobby Green money line. I wouldn't fuck about getting super specific. I wouldn't get greedy and go for the better odds on decision for reasons I've already described in this video. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. And now I think it's time we move on to the next fight, which is going to be Christian Leroy Duncan versus Gregory Rodrigues. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see there's quite a big odds spread on Duncan's odds. We'll say an average odds of about 1.69, which is going to be minus 145 for an implied probability of 59%. If we take a look at the odds on his opponent, Rodrigues, he's about an average of 2.20, which is going to be plus 120 for an implied probability of 45%. So Rodrigues is 32 years old, 6'3", with a 75-inch reach. Duncan, 29 years old, 6'2", with a 79-inch reach. And we can see both guys about the same age, nothing major there. About the same height, and we can see that Duncan has got a 4-inch reach advantage, which is interesting in some ways because Duncan tries to fight long, but similar to what we said about Belal last week when we broke down his fight against Do Ho Choi, like with Algio last week, we said that Algio tries to fight long but doesn't do a particularly good job of using his length, and we saw that with how Choi was able to get inside last week and causing big problems. We also saw this weakness in Duncan when he made his debut against Armen Petrosian. So while he looks kind of cool in that sideways karate stance and he does fight long and he does fight confidently against lower level strikers, when you deal with higher level strikers, a guy like Duncan can run into a bit of trouble. And the Armen Petrosian fight is a great fight to illustrate that weakness in his skill set. So the only other X factor to really focus on, Duncan's got home advantage, and we've been through all the reasons why that is a good thing. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, I feel like every time we break down a Gregory Rodrigues fight, we talk about how good of an MMA grappler he is, how strong of an MMA grappler he is. So where in this week's breakdowns we've talked a lot about certain fighters who have, great cardio but lack grappling control and physicality in the case of Belal Muhammad, or grapplers like Paddy Pimblett who are very strong and very physically imposing but don't have the cardio to grapple for very long. Gregory Rodrigues is in that sweet spot in the middle where his cardio is reasonably good, his grappling controls and physicality is reasonably good, so he's a solid MMA grappler. He's got like that nice balance of the two. So with Gregory Rodrigues, if he comes into this fight with a grappling heavy game plan, I think he could likely do pretty well. And just like with Tom Aspinall, due to a lack of footage, we don't have tons of information on what Leroy Duncan's takedown offence and ground game is like. But with him being primarily a striker, with him being from the UK, with him having that long, lanky, lean frame, chances are, if Rodrigues were to use a grappling heavy game plan, he'd likely do pretty well with it. Like I say, we don't have tons of evidence as to what as to what Duncan's ground game is like. But if we go to the third round of his fight against Petrosian, I'll just find it for you now. Just very quickly bring it up. This is literally all we've got to really work with. So if we take a look at this third round of the fight between Petrosian and Duncan, we can see that if we just skip ahead here, this is literally all we've got to work with. You can see Petrosian shoots a nice reactive double leg, takes Duncan down. About 2 minutes and 15 left to go in the round. Duncan just goes to this close guard position. Petrosian kind of gives him tons of space here off his back, which, you know, he should be using to try and scramble back up to his feet. So if you look at this position here, if you're in my live betting group, you'll know that we talk about positions like this all the time where, you know, Duncan should be using this space to either scramble over to the cage to stand back up, or to just try and get to his knees and stand back up from here, but he hesitates and just allows Petrosian to go right back into his guard. So this indicates to me that Duncan is very weak off his back, very bad on the ground. A minute later, he starts to stand back up, but just hesitated for way too long, and a really skilled grappler like Rodrigues could get to his back and, you know, put him in a real bad position after making a mistake like that. So Rodrigues likely has a huge advantage on the ground in this fight. Like I say, we don't know tons about Duncan's takedown offense and ground game. He's a little bit like Aspinall in that there isn't much recent footage available on it. But, you know, that sequence from the Petrosian fight suggests that he could be in a lot of trouble if Rodrigues tries to grapple this weekend. So what I really like about Gregory Rodrigues is that he's absolutely tough. Tough as nails. He's an absolute dog. He's aggressive. He hits very hard. He's got true legit knockout power. He can push a high pace for 3 rounds. Rodrigues' biggest weakness is obviously his striking defense. He's reckless. He does get dinged a lot. And Duncan's an absolute sniper on the feet. He moves very well. He's very accurate. He's a very dangerous striker. But what I did notice about Duncan in the Petrosian fight is that he didn't react well to pressure, and he didn't use his length particularly well. Petrosian was able to get inside on him and outstrike him relatively easily. And so with how aggressive Rodrigues is, with how much power he's got, Rodrigues is going to try and come forward aggressively. Duncan may have some success with counter-striking and maybe he lands a shot to knock Rodrigues out. But Rodrigues is the kind of guy to bite down on his mouthpiece and pressure you. And Duncan doesn't really react all that well to pressure. He's a little bit like Belal. Moves well and everything. And if you fight him at distance in the middle of the octagon, he's great at using his length to chip away at you. But as soon as you walk him down, get inside, rough him up on the inside, he isn't so good. He doesn't like it. And his striking defense from there isn't the best. So it's a very interesting fight. My lean personally is Rodrigues, simply because with Rodrigues' grappling, you know, he's got an area where he can take this fight and potentially dominate. If the fight stays standing, I could see it going either way. I could see Rodrigues' pressure getting to Duncan and Rodrigues outstriking Duncan on the outside, but I could also see, you know, Duncan playing the role of matador and kind of using Rodrigues' recklessness and poor defense against him to chip away at Rodrigues and potentially knock him out. We've seen Rodrigues rocked, wobbled, dropped in many of his past fights. So on the feet, I could see it going either way, but there's no doubt for me Rodrigues is going to have a huge advantage on the ground. And so with it being a fight that could go either way on the feet, for me, definitely lean Rodrigues, because that's a clear and obvious area where he's got an edge in this fight. So in terms of the over-under on this one, I'd be very surprised if the fight went to a decision, just because of how aggressive Rodrigues is, the fact that he's bad defensively, prone to getting dinged, rocked, wobbled, dropped, the fact that Duncan doesn't react well with pressure, and the fact that Rodrigues is very aggressive on the ground with ground and pound submissions if he were to get the fight there or use a grappling heavy game plan. So I do think it's more likely this fight ends inside the distance because of how aggressive Rodrigues is. He initiates action. but the odds are too steep for me to bet that, and I do not want to bet the over on a fight like this because of how aggressive Rodrigues is. In terms of most likely outcomes, let's take a look at Rodrigues' record. Does he ever get submissions? I think he favours ground and pound for the most part. Ground and pound, kind of ground and pound. Yeah, on the ground he seems to favour ground and pound in recent years, which would come in the knockout at TKO. Yeah, odds on Rodrigues to win by knockout at TKO, not great. Even worse on Duncan. Yeah, don't really like any of the props on this matchup. I would give those a miss. So now let's move on to the next fight. Okay, now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Arnold Allen versus Giga Chikadze. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see Arnold Allen is the favourite at average odds of about 1.41, which is going to be minus 244 for an implied probability of 71%. If we take a look at the odds on Chikadze, he's around an average of quite a big odds spread. We will say 3.0, which would be plus 200 for an implied probability of 33%. So Arnold Allen is 30 years old, 5'8" with a 70-inch reach. Chikadze, 35 years old, 6 foot tall with a 74-inch reach. So few X factors in this one to talk about. The first being age. So at 30 years old, Allen is right in his prime for featherweight, should be making big improvements from fight to fight. And I think his performance against Max Holloway suggests that he is. He looked great in that fight. So Allen, 30 years old. Chikadze is going to be 36 years old next month. 36 years old is very, very old for the featherweight division. So, you know, the lighter weight classes are all about speed, reflexes and athleticism, which are some of the first things to go as you start to get older. So Chikadze is at that stage in his career where you would expect him to be declining. On top of that, he's also a lot longer and taller than Allen. 4-inch reach advantage, taller as well. And Chikadze moves well, knows how to use his length. Pretty good striking defense. Very, very technical. So the size and reach advantage for Chikadze is meaningful in this matchup and is likely to make life difficult for Allen. The only other X factor we need to focus on is the fact that Allen does have home advantage. He is aggressive. He does fight at a high pace. And therefore, it may be difficult for Chikadze to win a decision if this fight goes to a decision. And the only other factor that I want to talk about, which may or may not be a big deal depending on how you feel about this kind of stuff. But at the beginning of this year, the UFC basically removed drug testing from the sport, or from the promotion I should say. They no longer have a relationship with USADA, and so there's very little performance enhancing drug testing in the UFC anymore. Now Arnold Allen's dad was a strongman, which in the UK is something that is, I guess, a sport where people just lift heavy things. I've never really seen the appeal of it myself. But his dad was a strongman. And I believe I've seen videos or interviews with Allen and his dad where his dad's been quite open about using steroids. And so all I will say is, over the last sort of 7 months of this year, I do feel we've seen a lot of fighters show up and put in performances that were very different from their performances a year prior to that. I mean, Radzhabov was a good example, in his fight last weekend against Trey Ogden, right? If you look at Radzhabov's earlier fights against Ribovic in the UFC, he was absolutely gassed out of his mind after one round against Ribovic. And then against Trey Ogden last weekend, he was pouring it on and putting Ogden in really bad positions in round 3 and really didn't slow down that much. So I think performance-enhancing drug use is absolutely rampant in the UFC at the moment. I think a lot of fighters are back using performance-enhancing drugs. And, I'm not accusing Allen of anything. I'm not saying anything other than I believe his dad has been quite open about using performance-enhancing drugs in the past, and maybe the acorn doesn't fall too far from the tree. I don't know. All I'm saying is it's obviously our job to try and make the best decisions possible with all the information we've got available in predicting most likely outcomes of these fights. And Arnold Allen perhaps fits the profile of someone that may use performance-enhancing drugs this weekend. I mean, if his dad used them, you know, who knows, man. That's all I got to say. You make your own mind up on that. So that's something to think about. Allen could look significantly better than he has done in the past. His last fight against Evloev, which was right at the point when UFC cut ties with USADA. This will really be the first time that we've seen Allen fight with no USADA drug testing. So, in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, I do think it's a pretty good fight for Chikadze. Allen is kind of wild and reckless on the feet. He's very aggressive. He does hit very hard. He does have true legit knockout power, but he's still a bit raw, still a bit reckless, not all that technical. Chikadze, a much better technical striker, moves a lot better, better footwork, better movement. Doesn't have the same kind of raw power that Allen has. Doesn't hit as hard. He's not as aggressive. He also doesn't throw as high of a volume of strikes. Allen is one of these guys who does throw a very high volume of strikes. Chikadze does have long periods of inactivity. Often struggles to put his stamp on rounds. And Chikadze also slows down a bit as fights wear on, whereas Allen is pretty aggressive for the full 3 rounds. So look, it won't be easy for Chikadze to win a decision against Allen in the UK, because hometown judging is a very big factor, and Allen is extremely aggressive. Chikadze is also at that stage in his career where he should be declining. However, skill for skill, if these two are just fighting in the apex on a Saturday night, Chikadze certainly has the capability of making this close, and I do think Chikadze is one of the livest underdogs on the card. And again, it just comes to it just comes down to letting the odds do the work for you, right? When you've got fighters like Allen or Aspinall or Edwards as these big favourites, and we know there are things their opponents can do that could potentially cause them big problems, naturally it makes sense that you want to be betting the underdogs if you really want to bet these fights. Because if you take the favourites at implied probabilities of 70, 75, 80%, what you're essentially saying by betting fighters in those odds ranges is that they have virtually no way to lose. And through the fight research, we've established that that isn't the case, because Edwards' takedown defence is bad and Belal is a good offensive wrestler. We don't know anything about Aspinall's cardio, chin, takedown defence, ground game, nothing. He's a complete unknown. And in the case of Arnold Allen, he's fighting a very dangerous, very skilled striker. And I just don't think you can cap Allen at better than 71% odds, which you'd need to in order to get any value on him. So if I'm absolutely forced to bet a fight like this, naturally I would take the big underdog. But it's not like I can come here and describe specific things in specific ways, or specific things Chikadze can do to win, or specific ways in which he's going to win. I just think that these odds are very, very wide. You know, like I always say every week in these videos, in order to justify odds in this odds range, the favourite has to have virtually no way to lose, because that's what a probability of 71% implies, and that just isn't the case with this fight. So if we take a look at the over-under on this one, what is interesting about the over-under on this fight is the under 1.5 rounds is set at 4.90, which is plus 390. For me, that is very, very aggressive, just because Allen usually comes out the gate very hard, very aggressive. Now, I know if you look at Allen's record, he is a bit of a decisionator. The vast majority of his fights have gone to a decision, but styles make fights. Evloev is a grappler, so he was able to neutralise the threat of Allen's striking. Holloway, obviously granite chin, one of the best strikers of all time, so no surprise Allen didn't get a quick finish there. He inflicted a lot of damage on Calvin Kattar in round 1. He knocked Hooker out in round 1. He dropped Sadiq Youssef twice, I believe, in this fight. Once in the first round, once in the second round. Lentz is a grappler. Melendez has got a granite chin, tough as nails. Rinaldi's a grappler. Mads Bernal's a grappler. Makwan's a grappler. Yahtzee Metzer is a grappler. So the point I'm trying to make is styles make fights. And when Allen has fought 2 strikers in Dan Hooker and Keita, he's come out the gate very hard, very aggressive. And in fact, you could say 3 because he dropped to the Yusuf. So Chikadze is obviously durable for sure. Take a look at his record. I'm not sure if he's ever been knocked out. So no, he's never been knocked out in MMA. However, he is 36 years old. He also has knockout power, and Allen's quite reckless. Allen does come out the gate very, very hard. So look, I'm not saying it's particularly likely this fight ends quickly, but the odds are wide for me. I'm surprised the odds are this wide. I'm very surprised the odds are this wide. 4.90. The implied probability on that is just 20%. I give this fight a far greater chance I give this fight a far greater chance than 20% of ending early, because if Allen does come out as aggressive as he did against Keita and Hooker, and Jigger stands his ground and exchanges, both are very dangerous strikers. Neither's going to be trying to take the other down. Someone could eat a bomb and get knocked out. So I'm probably not going to bet it. I don't like bets like this. I have my own system, my own strategy for being profitable, and this would deviate from that strategy, but those odds are very wide. I'm quite surprised they're that wide. And if we take a look at the prop bets on this fight, most likely outcome, Allen by decision. The odds reflect that. I wouldn't get greedy and go for Jigger by decision. I would just take the money line if you really want to bet this fight. So the prop on this one really would be under 1.5 rounds, or fight doesn't go to a decision. So I hope you found that useful. If you did, please hit the like button below. The growth on this channel is so slow, and when you hit the like button, it really helps send this video out to more people. So I'd really appreciate it if you could do that for me. It would give me the motivation to keep dropping videos on YouTube. So thank you very much for watching. Love you all. Take care. I'll be back with another breakdown video for next week's card very soon. Take care, everyone. Hope you crush it this weekend. Hope you make loads of money. Nice one, guys. Bye.